Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets comfortable and science slows down enough to breathe. Tonight, we're settling in with something so familiar that most of us hardly question it, even though we've looked into it in mirrors, windows, passport photos, and sleepy bathroom lighting for most of our lives. Your eyes. More specifically, the colour of them. Brown, blue, green, grey, hazel, and those difficult to describe shades that seem to change their minds depending on the weather, the lighting, or whether someone is trying a little too hard to sound mysterious on a first date. Eye colour is one of those features people notice quickly and remember surprisingly well. It becomes shorthand. The girl with the green eyes, the man with the pale blue stare, the baby with those huge brown eyes. And yet, for something so visible, it's often badly misunderstood. We talk about eye colour as if it were paint, as if somewhere inside the eye there's a neat little pot of blue or green or amber tucked away like a tiny cosmetics drawer. But the truth is stranger than that, and much more interesting. So before we wander any farther into tonight's gentle little investigation, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and if you care to play along, what colour are your eyes? Or what colour have you always called them? Because that can be its own adventure. Some eyes are easy to label. Others are a lifelong negotiation between brown and hazel, blue and grey, green and, well, it depends. And if this is the sort of thing you enjoy, these slow rambles through the hidden logic of ordinary life, do give the video a like and subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of biology find more people who want something curious and calm at the end of the day. I only hope the subject is soothing enough to help you wind down, and not so interesting that you end up in the bathroom with your phone torch pointed at your own face, trying to decide whether your left eye has more gold in it than your right. Though, if that does happen, I can hardly judge. Human beings have spent a very long time staring into each other's eyes and drawing all sorts of conclusions from what they saw there. Romance, danger, intelligence, magic, ancestry, honesty, temperament, even fate. We've made poems about eyes, songs about eyes, superstitions about eyes, and more than one deeply questionable compliment based entirely on lighting conditions and enthusiasm. But underneath all that storytelling, there's a real biological system at work. Tissue, pigment, structure, light. Nothing supernatural and yet still quite remarkable. It is funny, really, how often eye colour gets treated like a personality test in disguise. Brown eyes are supposed to mean one thing, blue another, green another again, and somewhere online there is probably still a list explaining that grey-eyed people are wise but difficult, or that hazel eyes belong to old souls who would have done very well in a candle shop in 1842. We do love attaching meaning to visible traits. It gives the world a sense of order. If we can look at someone and imagine we've learned something important within seconds, that feels efficient. Slightly ridiculous perhaps, but efficient. The trouble is that biology is not especially interested in our appetite for tidy little symbolic categories. Eye colour is not a moral signal, not a personality code, not a reliable guide to who someone is when they are tired, generous, impatient, funny, or terrible at answering emails. What it does tell us, however, is something about pigmentation, inheritance, development, and the way light behaves inside living tissue, which I would argue is better. Slightly less useful for writing dramatic novels, perhaps, but much better if you enjoy knowing how real things work. Consider how early we notice eye colour. One of the first things adults say about a newborn, after confirming a respectable number of fingers and toes, is often something like, "Look at those eyes." Then comes the guessing game. Will they stay blue? Will they darken? Do they look like mum's eyes? Dad's? Granddad's? Some ancestor no one has mentioned since a family wedding in 1998? Even before a child can focus properly on faces, the adults around them are already reading identity into the eyes. That instinct is ancient and deeply human. We are face-reading creatures. We look for familiarity, difference, health, emotion, intention. We search for clues constantly, often without knowing we're doing it. and because the eyes sit right in the centre of the face and catch light so dramatically, they become part of that whole process of recognition. Not just how we see the world, but how the world sees us back. And eye colour does seem dramatic, doesn't it? A dark brown iris can look almost black indoors, and then suddenly warm and honeyed in sunlight. Blue eyes can appear icy in one room and soft as denim in another. Hazel eyes can refuse to cooperate with language altogether. Are they green, brown, gold? Technically, yes. Emotionally, all of the above. Grey eyes have a talent for looking like weather. Green eyes tend to cause entirely normal adults to lose perspective and start speaking as though they've been briefly possessed by a Victorian poet. There is something visually powerful about the iris, that ring of tissue around the pupil with its radiating fibres and little crypts and folds, like a landscape arranged in a circle. Even without knowing any biology, people sense that the eye is not a flat disk of colour. It has depth. It catches light unevenly. It changes with the environment. It seems almost active. That impression matters because it points us toward the truth. Eye colour is not just colour. It is structure, plus pigment, plus light, plus perception, all working together. That is one reason the question in tonight's subject is worth asking carefully. What does your eye colour actually mean, and how does it work? The first part is where many people get led astray, because we've inherited a lot of myths and shortcuts. Some are harmless enough. Brown eyes are warm, blue eyes are piercing, green eyes are rare and mysterious, hazel eyes are impossible to forget. It all sounds nice, very flattering often. No one ever writes a sonnet that begins, "Her irises displayed a statistically ordinary balance of melanin distribution shaped by inherited gene variants." Though perhaps they should. It would be good for science. Not very good for courtship, but splendid for accuracy. The real meaning of eye colour is less about destiny and more about biology. It can hint at ancestry in a broad and messy way. It can tell us something about how much melanin is present in the iris and how light is being scattered. In a medical setting, changes in eye colour can sometimes signal development, aging, injury or disease. But it is not a window into virtue, intelligence, emotional depth, or whether someone secretly has a rebellious spirit and an excellent taste in scarves. Still, we can understand why people go there. Eyes matter enormously in human interaction. We notice them quickly because they help us read attention and emotion. We look to see whether someone is focused on us, distracted, frightened, amused, annoyed, or pretending to be interested while actually wondering what to have for lunch. The whites of our eyes, unusually visible compared to many other animals, make gaze direction easier to follow. That has likely helped us cooperate as a species. So when the eye already carries so much social weight, it makes sense that its colour gets folded into our impressions as well. Brown might feel steady because it is common and familiar in many populations. Blue might feel striking when it contrasts strongly with skin or hair. Green might attract attention precisely because it is less common globally. We then confuse attention with meaning. Something stands out, so we assume it must stand for something. Human brains are very good at that move. They're also very good at being wrong in a confident tone. Another reason eye colour inspires so much curiosity is that it seems simple until you try to explain it properly. Hair colour feels easier somehow. Skin tone, though complex, is at least obviously connected with pigment. But blue eyes create an immediate puzzle. Blue from what, exactly? There is no blue pigment in the iris the way there is blue ink in a pen. So where does the blue come from? Why do two brown-eyed parents sometimes have a blue-eyed child, but not always? Why can the eyes of a newborn shift over time? Why do hazel eyes seem to change from one day to the next, even when, strictly speaking, they haven't? Why can one person's irises be different colours entirely? And why do people continue to insist that eye colour follows one single tidy rule they remember from school, usually involving one dominant gene and a Punnett square that behaved itself for about 10 minutes before real genetics arrived and made everything more complicated? That is part of the charm of the topic. eye colour sits right at the place where everyday observation meets deeper biology. You can notice it instantly with no microscope, no lab, no special training at all. Then, if you lean in just a little, the simple thing opens into a whole chain of questions about cells, tissues, inheritance, optics, development, and evolution. It's a good reminder that familiar things are often only familiar on the surface. Most of life is like that. A leaf, a freckle, a yawn, a heartbeat, the little ache in your legs after a long walk, the reason onions make you cry, the way your eyes seem one shade in the morning and another near sunset. Common enough to ignore, complex enough to study for decades. Biology is full of ordinary miracles hiding under routine. Now, before we go too far into the mechanics, it helps to pause on the word means, because that word does a lot of mischief. When people ask what eye colour means, they often mean one of several quite different things. They may mean what causes it. They may mean what does it say about my family background. They may mean does it affect vision. They may mean is one colour rarer than another. They may mean can it change. They may mean does it reveal anything about my health. Or, less scientifically but very commonly, they may mean what kind of person does this make me? Those are not all foolish questions. They're just mixed together in a way that can make the answers seem more mystical than they are. Once we separate them out, the fog starts to lift. Some meanings are biological, some are cultural, some are statistical, some are pure folklore wearing a lab coat it did not earn. Take ancestry, for instance. Eye colour can sometimes reflect population history in broad terms, but not neatly enough to treat any one person like a map. Brown eyes are common across much of the world. Blue and green eyes are more frequent in certain parts of Europe and among populations with historical European ancestry. Yet human migration, mixing, and inheritance have never respected our craving for sharp categories. Families carry genes in surprising combinations. Children inherit shuffled versions of that history. A person may have dark eyes and light-skinned relatives, pale eyes and dark-haired siblings, or some family combination that makes every reunion look like genetics is showing off. Eye colour can hint at inherited patterns, yes, but it doesn't come stamped with a neat little certificate explaining exactly where every branch of your family tree has been. Biology rarely presents itself with that kind of administrative efficiency. Then there is the matter of rarity, which people also love. Which eye colour is rarest? Which is most common? Where do amber eyes fit? What about grey? This obsession is understandable. Humans collect rarity the way magpies collect shiny things. We enjoy finding out that something is uncommon, and we enjoy it even more when that uncommon thing happens to belong to us. But rarity is a slippery concept because it depends on how you define categories and which population you're talking about. It also tells you very little about importance. Blue eyes are not better because they are less common globally than brown. Brown eyes are not less interesting because many people have them. Common does not mean biologically boring. In fact, common traits often have the richest stories because they are the result of long, complex, successful histories. Brown eyes are not the background setting of humanity. They are a brilliant, functional, pigment-rich outcome of human variation. The same goes for every shade we tend to romanticize or overlook. Health is another area where people search for meaning, and here we do need a bit more care. In ordinary circumstances, eye colour is simply a natural variation. But the eye is a living structure, and like any living structure, it can change under certain conditions. Age, injury, medications, inflammation, and rare disorders can all affect appearance. Some babies are born with eyes that later darken, as melanin production increases. Some adults notice subtle shifts over time, especially in the way light reveals the iris. Some changes are harmless. Others deserve a professional look. That does not make eye colour ominous. It simply reminds us that the eye is tissue, not decoration. Beautiful, certainly. Socially important, absolutely. But still part of the body, still governed by cells and chemistry, rather than complements and mythology. And then, of course, there is the visual trickery. Anyone who has ever argued with a friend about whether their eyes are green or hazel has already encountered the fact that eye colour is not always easy to pin down. Light entering the eye and reflecting off its structures can create different impressions. Clothing can affect perceived contrast. Surrounding skin tone matters. Makeup matters. Sunlight matters. Whether the pupil is wide or narrow changes what part of the iris you notice first. A photograph may flatten what the eye sees in person or exaggerate it. People are often convinced their eye colour changes dramatically with mood. In truth, mood may influence pupil size, and pupil size can change the visible distribution of colour, which can make the whole eye look a bit different. That is not your iris having an emotional crisis. It is optics doing what optics does best, which is making human beings sound mystical when physics would do just fine. What I like most about this topic, though, is that it lets us correct the myths without draining away the fascination. Sometimes people worry that explanation spoils wonder, as if once you know the mechanism, the magic goes out of the thing. I've never found that to be true, quite the opposite. Knowing that blue eyes are not blue because of blue pigment, but because of how light behaves inside the iris, makes them more interesting, not less. Learning that the same pigment involved in skin and hair helps shape eye colour ties together parts of the body we often treat as separate. Discovering that several genes, rather than one simple switch, contribute to eye colour makes real inheritance feel more alive than the oversimplified schoolbook version. Explanation does not flatten reality. It adds depth to it. It gives the everyday world a second layer and then a third. A mug is no longer just a mug once you know a bit about ceramics and heat transfer and glaze chemistry. And an iris is no longer just a pretty ring once you know. It is a working biological structure built from cells, fibres, pigment, and light. So tonight, we're not going to treat eye colour as a horoscope for the face. We're not going to assign your irises a hidden personality type, or suggest that one shade means you're stubborn, while another means you're secretly good at keeping plants alive. We're going to do something much more satisfying. We're going to take a familiar feature and look at it closely enough that it becomes new again. We'll look at what the iris is, where the colour actually comes from, why brown is so common, how blue can exist without blue pigment, what makes hazel and green and grey so slippery to define, how genes influence the whole affair, why colour can shift across infancy and over a lifetime, and what eye colour can and cannot honestly tell us. Nothing dramatic then. Just a straightforward evening spent casually dismantling several popular misconceptions while admiring the engineering of the human face, and perhaps that is the nicest way to begin. Not with a grand claim, but with the quiet recognition that your eyes are both ordinary and extraordinary at once. Ordinary because nearly everyone you've ever met has some version of this same structure, irises opening and narrowing around their pupils, taking in light, working constantly without applause. Extraordinary because no two are exactly alike in pattern, because their appearance is shaped by a subtle combination of development and inheritance, and because a thing most people summarise in a single word, brown or blue or green, turns out to be far more layered than the label suggests. There is a whole piece of biology sitting in plain sight every time you meet your own reflection. We tend to think mystery belongs to distant galaxies or deep oceans or creatures with too many legs. But sometimes it lives in the very centre of the face, pretending to be simple. So as you settle in and let the day loosen its grip a little, keep that small question in mind. When you say what colour your eyes are, what are you really describing? A pigment? A pattern? A trick of light? A family inheritance? A category that only works from certain angles? The answer, as it turns out, is a bit of all of that, and to make sense of it, we should start not with blue or brown or green as labels, but with the structure doing the work in the first place. Because before eye colour can mean anything at all, we need to understand what exactly we are looking at when we look into an iris, and why that ring of tissue can seem so simple from across the room and so complicated the moment we move a little closer. If we want to understand what eye colour really is, the first useful thing to do is stop thinking of it as a label and start thinking of it as a physical effect. That sounds less romantic, I know. It has all the charm of someone taking a love poem and replacing it with a maintenance manual. But in biology, physical effects are often where the real fascination begins. When people say they have blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes, they're usually describing the appearance of the iris, the coloured ring around the pupil. That much is simple enough. The trouble begins when we imagine that appearance is just a matter of paint, as though the eye has been filled in with a tidy flat shade, like a wall sample from a hardware store. In reality, the iris is a living structure, not a sticker. It has layers, fibres, cells, blood vessels, and tiny variations in texture. It responds to light, it changes with pupil size, and its colour depends not only on what material is there, but on how light interacts with that material. So eye colour is not just a substance, it is an outcome. The iris itself sits at the front of the eye and surrounds the pupil, which is the dark opening that allows light to enter. You can think of the iris as part curtain, part camera mechanism, part decorative biological masterpiece that most of us only notice when someone has particularly striking genetics or particularly good bathroom lighting. Its practical job is to control how much light gets through by making the pupil larger or smaller. In bright light, the pupil constricts. In dim light, it widens. The iris is what performs that adjustment, using tiny muscles that work constantly without requiring you to issue a single instruction. Very considerate of it, really. You already have enough to manage. The iris handles the doorway. But because the iris is visible, and because it contains pigment and structure that affect the way light bounces around, it also becomes the part of the eye we identify by colour. Now that word colour sounds straightforward, but in biology and optics it gets slippery quite quickly. Sometimes colour comes from pigment, meaning molecules absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect others. A red flower looks red because pigments in its petals absorb some wavelengths and reflect more of the red ones back toward your eyes. Brown eyes, in broad terms, work close to that sort of system. They contain more melanin, the pigment also involved in skin and hair colour, and this higher melanin content makes the iris absorb more light, producing a darker appearance. But blue eyes are not blue in the same simple way that a blueberry is blue, or a painted front door is blue. There is not a stash of blue pigment sitting in the iris doing the work. Instead, blue eye colour emerges largely from the way light is scattered in the iris, when there is relatively little melanin present in certain layers. So before we even get into the different shades, it helps to accept a slightly strange fact. What you call eye colour is not always equivalent to pigment colour. Sometimes it is a visual effect produced by tissue structure plus light. That is why the iris deserves a closer look. It is made of several parts, but for our purposes the important point is that it contains cells and connective tissue arranged in ways that influence appearance. The front layers of the iris include a boundary region and a stroma, which is a sort of connective tissue full of collagen fibres, pigment cells, and blood vessels. Behind that are more heavily pigmented layers. The amount and distribution of melanin in the iris, especially in the front portions, strongly influence whether an eye appears dark or light. If there is a lot of melanin, the iris tends to look brown. If there is much less melanin in the front layers, light entering the tissue is scattered in a way that can make the iris look blue or grey. So already we're dealing with something more subtle than a child's box of crayons. The iris is less like a coloured disc and more like a built-in optical surface with biological ingredients. This also explains why eye colour can have depth. When you look closely at an iris, especially in a sharp photograph, you do not see a solid circle of uniform shade. You see radiating lines, little speckles, rings, crypts, flecks, and areas that catch light differently. Some parts look darker than others. Some seem almost golden near the pupil and greener or greyer farther out. Some have a dark rim around the edge, which is called a limbal ring, and that ring can make the central colour seem more intense by contrast. These details are not decorative extras added by nature because it was feeling artistic one afternoon. They are the visible result of tissue structure, pigment patterning, and the geometry of the iris itself. The more closely you look, the less sensible it becomes to describe eye colour as one simple thing. It is closer to a visual summary of a complicated surface. That surface, by the way, is not only about beauty or recognition. The iris is part of the machinery of sight. Its main job is to regulate incoming light, rather like the aperture in a camera. Too much light and the image system gets overwhelmed. Too little, and you're struggling to gather enough information. The iris adjusts the pupil accordingly, so the same structure that gives the eye its visible colour is also helping manage visual conditions all day long. This is one reason it makes no sense to treat eye colour as though it were purely cosmetic. The iris is not makeup applied to vision. It is part of vision. The colour is the appearance of a working biological tissue that also performs an essential role. That is a good general rule in anatomy, actually. If something in the body looks decorative, it often turns out to be doing several jobs at once. When people try to explain eye colour too quickly, they often say something like, "It's just pigment." That is true only in part, and the missing part matters. Pigment does a great deal, especially melanin, but structure matters too. Think of the sky for a moment. The sky looks blue, but not because the air above us has been dyed blue with some enormous celestial marker pen. It looks blue because molecules in the atmosphere scatter shorter wavelengths of light more effectively. Blue eyes are not exactly the same situation, but the comparison helps because it reminds us that visible colour can come from the interaction of light with a material, not simply from coloured pigment. In lighter eyes, lower melanin in the front layers of the iris allows light scattering effects to become more visible. The result is blue or grey or something in between, depending on the exact tissue properties and lighting conditions. So when someone says, "My eyes are blue," what they really mean is, the physical properties of my iris cause it to appear blue under ordinary viewing conditions, which is admittedly less elegant at parties but much more correct. Brown eyes, meanwhile, are often described as if they were the default setting, which is a bit unfair. Brown eyes are not the absence of novelty. They are richly pigmented and optically effective. High melanin content in the iris absorbs more light, producing that darker appearance that can range from warm amber brown to very deep brown that appears almost black in certain conditions. And even within brown eyes there is huge variation. Some are golden and translucent in bright sun. Some look chestnut or coffee-coloured. Some have lighter rings around the pupil. Some have darker outer edges. Indoors, two sets of brown eyes may appear similar, while outdoors one suddenly glows like polished wood and the other looks almost velvet dark. Again, the category hides the detail. We flatten a complex appearance into one word because language likes efficiency. Biology, on the other hand, likes variation. The same goes for green, hazel, grey, and those colours that spark minor debates in family kitchens. Hazel in particular is a triumph of biological refusal to fit into neat boxes. People often use hazel to mean not clearly one thing or another, and in practice that is not far off. Hazel eyes tend to involve moderate melanin, uneven pigment distribution, and a mix of optical effects that produce greenish, brownish, or golden tones depending on the angle and lighting. Sometimes there is a brown ring near the pupil and a greener outer region. Sometimes there are amber flecks scattered through a lighter background. Sometimes the whole eye seems to shift from olive to gold to light brown depending on what the person is wearing and whether the sun has decided to cooperate. Grey eyes work in a similar realm of low to moderate pigmentation and structural effects, often appearing softer or less saturated than blue eyes. None of these categories are fake exactly, but they are approximate. They are useful labels for patterns that are more continuous than discrete. That point is worth lingering on because we are very fond of pretending that nature comes pre-sorted into tidy bins. Brown, blue, green, done. But biological traits often vary across a spectrum. We create categories because they help us talk, not because the body has filed formal paperwork agreeing to them. Eye colour is a good example of this. There are certainly recognisable groupings, and some are more common than others. But between the obvious examples lies a broad territory of mixed and ambiguous appearances. One person's grey is another person's blue. One person's green is another person's hazel. A passport officer, a dating app, a grandmother, and a slightly overconfident school photographer may all describe the same pair of eyes differently. That does not mean eye colour is meaningless. It means the categories are human shortcuts laid over a biological continuum. Lighting makes this even more obvious. Eye colour is one of those traits that seems moody, though the mood belongs mostly to optics rather than temperament. In bright sunlight, the iris may reveal flecks and gradients that disappear indoors. Warm light can pull out amber tones. Cool light can make the same iris look greyer or bluer. A dark room with a single lamp can make brown eyes appear almost black. A cloudy day can flatten green into grey. A dilated pupil, which enlarges in dim light or emotional arousal, changes how much of the iris is visible and which regions stand out most strongly. So if someone insists their eyes change colour depending on their mood, the strict answer is usually no, not in the dramatic magical sense. But the practical answer is that their eyes may indeed look different under different conditions because the visible balance of light, contrast, and iris structure has changed. Human beings are not wrong to notice this. They are just sometimes wrong about the explanation. It is also useful to clear up one more visual illusion right here, namely the darkness of the pupil. People often treat pupil and iris as though both are coloured surfaces, but the pupil is not really a surface at all. It is an opening. It looks black because light entering it is largely absorbed inside the eye rather than reflected back out toward you. That means the iris is the coloured tissue surrounding a dark hole, and that contrast makes the colour more striking. The crispness of that contrast can change with lighting and pupil size. A large black pupil can make the surrounding iris look brighter or more intense by comparison. A very small pupil can reveal more of the iris and bring out its finer details. The eye, in other words, is constantly changing its visual presentation slightly, even when its anatomy remains the same. No wonder people romanticize it. It's one of the few places where optics and expression live so close together. Another common misunderstanding is the idea that eye colour is a shallow surface coating. In fact, because it depends on the presence and arrangement of pigment in the iris, and on the way light interacts with tissue, it is part of the organ's built structure. You cannot scrape it off. You cannot think it into another shade despite what the internet occasionally promises in a tone of suspicious optimism. Coloured contact lenses work by placing an artificial tinted layer over the cornea, but that is a cosmetic overlay, not a transformation of the iris itself. The real iris remains what it is underneath, still opening and closing, still holding its pattern, still made of the same cells and fibres. The desire to alter eye colour permanently has produced some rather alarming ideas over the years, and those are best approached with caution, scepticism, and a healthy respect for the fact that eyes are for seeing, not for experimental interior design. Now, if eye colour is an outcome, what exactly are the ingredients of that outcome? The main ones are melanin content, melanin distribution, tissue structure, and light behaviour. Melanin is the pigment that darkens the iris. More melanin usually means darker eyes. Less melanin in the front layers allows more scattering effects, which can make the eyes look blue or grey. Intermediate amounts and uneven patterns can contribute to green or hazel appearances. Tissue structure matters because the collagen-rich stroma of the iris affects how light is reflected and scattered. Light matters because no eye colour exists visually without it. The iris does not glow in its own hue like a little biological lantern. We see it because light strikes it, enters it, scatters, reflects, and then reaches our retinas. Eye colour, like many visible traits, is partly a relationship between the object and the observer. No light, no visible colour, just a very intimate darkness. And because the observer matters too, perception enters the story. Human colour perception is not a perfect instrument. It is influenced by surrounding colours, contrast, expectations, and context. Put someone in a white shirt and their eyes may seem more saturated. Put them against a warm background and cooler tones may stand out. Ask 3 relatives whether a baby's eyes are blue or grey, and you may receive 5 answers, 2 family anecdotes, and 1 claim that the child has old eyes, which is medically unhelpful but emotionally expressive. This does not make colour categories useless. It simply reminds us that visible traits are always filtered through perception as well as biology. What eye colour really is then is not a simple dot on a chart. It is a visible effect produced by anatomy and physics, interpreted by a human brain that enjoys naming things. That is why the question matters. Once you understand that eye colour is the appearance of the iris shaped by pigment and light, several other puzzles begin to make sense. You can see why 2 eyes with the same basic category may still look very different. You can see why photographs are unreliable judges. You can see why blue eyes do not require blue pigment, why hazel eyes are so hard to pin down, and why infants can be born with one apparent colour that shifts later as melanin production develops. Most importantly, perhaps, you can stop asking the iris to behave like a flat painted surface when it's actually a textured living structure doing real work. So when someone says, "What colour are your eyes really?" the honest answer is a little richer than the one-word version. They are the colour your iris appears because of how much melanin it contains, how that melanin is arranged, how the tissue is built, how the light is falling, and how the observer's eye interprets the result. That may sound like too much information for casual conversation, and to be fair, it probably is. There are social limits to how much optical biology one can introduce before people begin backing slowly toward the snack table. But for us, moving gently through the question here, it gives us a much firmer starting point. Because once we know that eye colour is not paint but pigment plus structure plus light, the next thing to ask is what that pigment actually is, where it comes from, and why something as simple sounding as melanin ends up creating so many different human eyes. Now that we have the basic idea in place, that eye colour is not a flat coat of paint but the visible result of tissue, light, and pigment working together, we can move a little closer to the pigment itself, because this is where the story stops sounding decorative and starts sounding wonderfully practical. If the iris has colour because it contains pigment, what is that pigment exactly and how does the body make it? The answer is melanin, which is one of those biological substances most people have heard of, usually in connection with skin tone, sunscreen, or stern advice about ultraviolet radiation. But melanin is doing much more than sitting around waiting to be mentioned on a hot day. It is a deeply important pigment in the body, involved in the colouring of skin, hair, and eyes. And in the iris, it plays the central role in determining whether the eye appears dark, light, or somewhere in that slippery territory in between. Melanin is not a single dramatic splash of colour, the way a child might imagine paint in a watercolour box. It is a family of pigments produced by specialised cells called melanocytes. These cells are found in several places in the body, including the skin, hair follicles, and parts of the eye. Their job is to make melanin through a sequence of chemical reactions beginning with the amino acid tyrosine. That process is controlled by enzymes, especially one called tyrosinase, which sounds less like something from the human body and more like a regional train service, but it is in fact a key biological catalyst. Through this series of reactions, melanocytes produce pigment granules, tiny packets of melanin that can then be stored in cells and influence appearance by absorbing light. The important thing to keep in mind is that the iris does not become coloured, because it has somehow been dyed from the outside. It becomes coloured because cells within it manufacture pigment as part of normal development. That alone is rather satisfying, I think. The eye is not passively coloured. It builds its own appearance from within. Of course, biology rarely leaves a good answer simple for long, because melanin itself is not entirely straightforward. There are different forms of it, and in human pigmentation the 2 most commonly discussed are eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin is the darker brown to black form and is especially important in producing darker coloration. Pheomelanin is lighter, contributing more reddish or yellowish tones, and is more often talked about in relation to hair and skin than eye colour, though the chemistry of pigmentation is interconnected across the body. In the iris, darker eyes are strongly associated with greater amounts of eumelanin, particularly in the front layers. When there is a lot of this pigment, the eye absorbs more incoming light and appears brown or very dark brown. When there is much less pigment in those front layers, light scattering becomes more visible, and the eye may appear blue, grey or green depending on the structure and patterning involved. So if melanin is the pigment that paints the iris, it does so not by offering the eye a rainbow of separate inks, but by varying in amount, distribution and context. That is the clever part. The same basic pigment system can produce a wide range of appearances because the final effect depends on how much melanin is present, where in the iris it is concentrated, and how the tissue around it handles light. The body does not need a blue pigment for blue eyes or a green pigment for green eyes. It needs melanin, structure, and the laws of optics, which is a rather economical arrangement when you think about it. Nature often achieves variety not by creating an entirely new ingredient for every possible result, but by adjusting the quantity and placement of existing ones. A little more here, a little less there, a different tissue depth, a different scattering effect, and suddenly one family can contain eyes like dark polished wood, wet moss, storm clouds, or pale winter glass. Melanocytes in the iris are particularly interesting because they do not all behave in precisely the same way in every person. Their activity is shaped by genetics and development. During early life, pigment production can continue to change, which is why many babies are born with eyes that appear lighter and then darken over the first months or years. This often surprises people, though it probably should not. A newborn is not a finished product in the decorative sense any more than in any other biological sense. Many systems are still developing. In babies who will later have brown or darker eyes, the melanocytes in the iris may simply not have produced or accumulated their full complement of melanin yet. As pigment builds in the iris over time, the visible colour shifts. That is not the eye changing its identity in some dramatic emotional gesture. It is development carrying on with its work, a very ordinary process, and yet one that families watch with the attention usually reserved for weather forecasts and celebrity gossip. This developmental aspect matters because it reminds us that melanin is active biology, not static decoration. The pigment is produced by living cells following inherited instructions within an environment of growth, hormones, and tissue maturation. The iris you have as an adult is the result of all that unfolding over time. That's also why eye colour can occasionally shift in subtle ways later in life, though not usually in the dramatic folklore sense. Changes in pigment density, tissue changes associated with aging, certain medications, injuries, or medical conditions can all affect how the iris looks. Most people will remain within the same general eye colour category, but the details may soften, deepen, or alter slightly with age and circumstance. Again, the lesson is that the iris is living tissue. We admire it as appearance, but the body is maintaining it as function. It is worth pausing on melanin's job beyond mere colour because the pigment is not there just to give photographers something to complement. Melanin absorbs light, including potentially damaging ultraviolet radiation, and this has protective significance in various tissues. In the eye, pigmentation helps manage light in a way that contributes to visual performance and tissue protection. A more heavily pigmented iris absorbs more stray light, which can reduce internal scatter and create a darker appearance. A lightly pigmented iris allows more light-related effects to remain visible, which is why lighter eyes often look more translucent or reflective. This does not mean dark eyes are somehow superior in every sense or light eyes defective in some Victorian melodrama. It simply means pigmentation has consequences, both visual and functional. Biology is rarely interested in beauty standards, but it is very interested in trade-offs. That point becomes clearer when we think about how similar melanin's role is across different parts of the body. In skin, more melanin tends to mean greater natural protection from ultraviolet radiation, though not immunity, and less melanin tends to mean greater sensitivity. In hair, melanin influences whether hair appears black, brown, blonde or red in combination with pigment type and concentration. In the iris, melanin shapes visible eye colour and light absorption. The same basic pigment system is doing related work in different tissues, which is one of the nicest features of biology when you notice it. The body does not invent every trait from scratch. It reuses materials, pathways and cell types in slightly different contexts, making a whole person out of recurring themes. Melanin appears in different places for different reasons, but the underlying chemistry links those places together. So the colour of your iris is not an isolated curiosity. It belongs to a broader story of pigmentation throughout the body. Even so, the iris is special because it turns that pigment story into such a visually precise effect. Skin pigmentation tends to be spread across a wide surface. Hair pigmentation runs along strands. The iris presents its pigment in a compact circular structure that catches light directly and sits in the middle of the face. That makes small differences in melanin content feel very noticeable. A modest increase or decrease in pigment in the front layers of the iris can shift the perceived colour category quite dramatically. And because the iris is textured, the pigment is rarely laid down with mathematical uniformity. One area may hold more than another. Flecks, rings and mixed tones can appear. Some eyes have central heterochromia, where the area around the pupil is distinctly different in colour from the outer iris. Others have scattered specks of amber or brown within an otherwise green or blue field. These patterns come from how pigment and tissue are arranged, not from some whimsical artist's brush flicking highlights into place. This is also why calling melanin the pigment that paints the iris is true, but only if we do not take the metaphor too literally. Paint sits on a surface. Melanin sits within cells and tissues. Paint can be mixed to any hue in a shop. Melanin is part of a biological system with particular pathways and particular effects. Paint can be applied evenly with enough patience and a respectable brush. The iris is built by development, not by decorators, and development prefers complexity. So melanin paints the iris in the sense that it creates its visible tone, but the iris remains a layered living structure in which pigment becomes part of an optical environment. That is the phrase I keep coming back to with eye colour, an optical environment. Because the pigment does not act alone. It acts in tissue, in light, in a body, in a face being looked at from different angles and under changing conditions. There is also a tendency, especially in oversimplified school explanations, to treat melanin like an on-off switch. More melanin equals brown, less equals blue, end of story, everyone go home. But the real picture is more gradual. Eye colour is influenced by the amount of melanin, yes, but also by how that melanin is distributed, and by the microscopic structure of the iris. Green eyes, for instance, generally involve relatively low to moderate melanin combined with light scattering and yellowish or brownish pigment tones that alter the effect. Hazel eyes often involve uneven melanin distribution, producing mixtures of brown, gold and green. Grey eyes may involve very little melanin in ways that produce a softer, less saturated scattering effect. So even when melanin is the central pigment in the story, its relationship to visible colour is not a simple one-to-one code. It is more like a major ingredient in a recipe whose final taste depends on texture, proportion and preparation. A slightly culinary analogy, perhaps, but a useful one, provided no one starts describing hazel eyes as underseasoned. Of course, because eye colour is so visible, people often imagine that melanin must be there for display. But evolution and development do not operate with the priorities of a portrait painter. Pigments arise and persist because they serve or accompany biological functions, because genes regulating them are inherited, and because populations change over time through ancestry, environment, and chance. The beauty we see in eye colour is real enough as an experience, but it is our interpretation of a functional tissue. The iris did not evolve in order to look soulful in evening light. It evolved as part of a visual organ that controls light entry. The pigment within it contributes to how that organ behaves. That we then stare into each other's faces and become philosophical about it is very much our contribution to the arrangement. Still, there is something pleasantly grounding about tracing all the myths and compliments back to melanin. What lovely eyes, we say, and somewhere behind the compliment are melanocytes, pigment granules, enzyme activity, and inherited variants in genes affecting pigmentation pathways. Not the sort of thing one writes in a valentine, certainly, unless one is determined never to be invited back. But it is a reminder that the body's visible charm rests on processes that are often chemical, cellular, and surprisingly practical. We do not diminish beauty by knowing this. We reveal the machinery that makes beauty possible. A brown iris looks deep and warm not because it contains some mysterious emotional force, but because it is rich in light-absorbing pigment. A blue iris looks cool and bright because low pigment and tissue structure allow light scattering to dominate. A green or hazel iris seems elusive because intermediate pigment levels and mixed optical effects refuse to settle into simplicity. Melanin is at the center of all of that, and yet, for all its importance, melanin alone cannot fully explain why one eye ends up brown and another blue, or why certain shades are far more common in the human population than others. Pigment gives us the mechanism but not the pattern of distribution across humanity. To understand that, we have to step back from the iris itself and look at inheritance and history. Why do so many people in the world have brown eyes? Why is darker pigmentation the global norm, while lighter eyes are concentrated in particular populations? Why did that pattern emerge, and what does it tell us about the movement and variation of human beings over time? Once melanin enters the picture, those questions start waiting quite patiently at the edge of the room, and they are the natural place to go next, because knowing what the pigment is only gets us so far. The bigger puzzle is why the human story has arranged that pigment the way it has. Once melanin enters the story, a very natural question follows almost immediately. If this pigment helps determine how dark or light the iris appears, then why do brown eyes show up so often across the human population? Why do they appear again and again in family lines, across continents, through long stretches of history, as though human biology keeps returning to the same basic answer? The short version is that brown eyes became common because they are the result of higher melanin levels in the iris, and darker pigmentation appears to have been the ancestral human condition. But that sentence, tidy as it is, hides a much larger story, one involving early humans, sunlight, inheritance, migration, and the fact that common traits are usually not accidents. They are often the visible leftovers of long biological histories that have had a great deal of time to settle in. It helps, first of all, to let go of the idea that brown eyes are simply the plain version of eye colour, the standard issue setting that nature hands out before getting interesting elsewhere. People slip into that view very easily, especially in cultures where blue or green eyes are treated as especially striking. But common should never be confused with dull. A sparrow is common and a peacock is uncommon in many places, but one would be foolish to conclude that the sparrow is biologically less worthy of attention. Brown eyes are common because they sit close to the deep and durable logic of human pigmentation. They are not the fallback option. They are one of the main historical outcomes of how our species developed and spread. To understand that, we have to go back much farther than families comparing baby photos at the kitchen table. We have to step back into early human history, into ancestral populations living under environmental conditions that shaped pigmentation across the body. The same melanin system that influences the iris is part of the broader pigmentation system affecting skin and hair. In humans, darker pigmentation appears to have been the original state in early populations, especially those living in regions with strong sun exposure. This makes sense when you remember what melanin does. It absorbs light, including ultraviolet radiation, and in the skin especially, that protection matters a great deal. Early humans evolving in Africa would have faced substantial exposure to intense sunlight, and darker pigmentation would have been advantageous in helping protect the body from ultraviolet damage while maintaining crucial biological balances. Skin and iris are not the same tissue and do not evolve for exactly the same reasons, but they are connected through the same pigment chemistry and the same general history of melanocyte activity. So when we say brown eyes became common, we are really saying that darker iris pigmentation stayed close to the ancestral pattern as humans diversified. That is an important phrase, ancestral pattern, because it tells us something about timing. Brown eyes are not common because lighter eyes somehow failed to spread widely enough to replace them. Brown eyes were already there, embedded in the original pigmentation framework of our species. In other words, darker eyes did not become common after a contest. They began common because early humans likely carried the genetic combinations that supported higher melanin levels in the iris. Lighter eye colours, which are much more concentrated in certain populations, appear to have emerged later as variations within this broader human story. So the real question is not why brown won some grand beauty competition in prehistory. The real question is why darker pigmentation remained so widespread while lighter forms arose more locally and under more specific historical circumstances. There is also a practical side to darker irises that should not be ignored. Melanin in the iris affects how much stray light is absorbed rather than scattered. A more heavily pigmented iris tends to absorb more light, which contributes to the darker appearance we call brown. This does not mean that brown-eyed people possess some secret visual superpower unavailable to the rest of us, though I'm sure someone online has claimed as much with tremendous confidence and very little evidence. It simply means pigmentation affects the optical behaviour of the eye. In strong sunlight or highly reflective conditions, greater iris pigmentation may reduce some internal light scatter. The effect should not be exaggerated into mythology, but it is part of the functional story. Biology likes traits that work, and dark pigmentation in the eye is perfectly workable across a huge range of human environments. Another reason brown eyes stayed common is that genetic change does not spread evenly or universally just because it happens. Human populations moved, separated, mixed, adapted, and sometimes remained relatively isolated for long periods. When a lighter eye colour variant emerges in one region or population, it does not automatically sweep across the entire species. Human history is not a smooth river carrying every new trait everywhere at once. It is more like a tangle of streams, some joining, some branching, some drying, some meeting again centuries later. Brown eyes remained common globally because the ancestral darker pigmentation state was already widespread in the much larger human population, and because many groups continued to pass along the genetic variants associated with that darker pigmentation. Lighter eye colours, by contrast, spread more narrowly and became more concentrated in certain lineages, especially in Europe and among people with substantial European ancestry. This is where people sometimes become tempted to turn eye colour into a story about superiority, uniqueness, or hidden status. And biology has to step in with a polite but firm refusal. Common traits are not biologically lesser, and rarer traits are not biologically finer. A trait can be widespread because it is old, stable, and deeply rooted in ancestral populations. It can be rare because it emerged later, or because it was shaped by local genetic drift, founder effects, or specific regional histories. Frequency is not a ranking system. Brown eyes are common in the human species for the same broad reason that the human hand has 5 digits, and the human body tends to arrange its organs in a familiar pattern. These are outcomes of shared inheritance carried over immense stretches of time. Not glamorous in the competitive sense, perhaps, but very important in the historical sense. The ancestral nature of brown eyes also helps explain why they appear in such a range of populations that otherwise look quite different from one another. People often make the mistake of treating visible traits as though they travel in neat bundles. They imagine that if skin tone, hair texture, facial features, and eye colour all belong to the general category of appearance, then they must always move together as a package, but inheritance is not that tidy. Traits are influenced by overlapping but distinct genetic systems. Brown eyes are found across populations with enormous diversity in skin colour, hair type, and facial structure, because the genes shaping iris pigmentation are part of a broader but not perfectly locked network of inherited traits. Shared dark eye pigmentation does not mean two populations are closely related in every obvious way. It means that darker iris pigmentation has been maintained across many different branches of human history, and that maintenance was likely helped by the fact that there was never any strong universal pressure pushing the entire species away from it. A trait that is already common and functional can remain common very easily. Evolution does not seek novelty for its own sake. It is not an interior designer refreshing the room every season because the curtains feel stale. If a pigmentation pattern works, and if the genes supporting it are widespread, it may continue with remarkable persistence. Brown eyes do not need a dramatic explanation for why they stayed. Stability is explanation enough in many cases. Human beings often ask why something is common, as though commonness must be actively defended, but a stable ancestral trait can simply continue because nothing has disrupted it on a large enough scale. At the same time, there may have been local conditions in which lighter pigmentation became more frequent for complex reasons. This is where the conversation becomes less certain and more interesting. Scientists can say with good confidence that darker pigmentation is ancestral, and that lighter eye colours became more common in certain populations later, especially in parts of Europe. But the exact reasons lighter eyes increased there are still discussed. Some possibilities involve genetic drift, where random changes in small populations become more pronounced over generations. Others involve founder effects, where a small group carrying certain variants gives rise to a larger later population, in which those variants are unusually common. There have also been suggestions about sexual selection, meaning that certain visible traits may have become more frequent partly because they were preferred by mates in particular populations. This is the sort of idea people enjoy a bit too much because it sounds like prehistory spent all its time flirting dramatically by torchlight. The truth is probably a mix of population history, genetic chance, and local patterns of reproduction, rather than one neat romance novel in genetic form. That uncertainty, however, does not weaken the central point. Brown eyes became common first because darker pigmentation was already the human starting condition, and second because that condition remained widespread through most of human population history. You do not need a special global event to explain why brown eyes are common. You only need a species that began with darker iris pigmentation, carried it into many descendant populations, and never experienced any universal shift away from it. Lighter eye colours require more specific explanation because they are more regionally concentrated and appear to be later developments. Brown eyes require explanation mostly because human beings, being human, tend to look at what is common and assume it has less of a story. In fact, common traits often have the longest stories of all. There is also something slightly misleading about the phrase brown eyes, because it encourages us to imagine one simple category when in fact there is tremendous variation within it. Brown eyes can be light brown, medium brown, dark brown, golden brown, reddish brown, nearly black in appearance, or filled with amber tones that only emerge clearly in strong light. Some have warm honey-coloured regions near the pupil. Some appear almost uniformly deep from edge to edge. Some show subtle shifts depending on the time of day or the surrounding colours. So when we say brown eyes became common, we're not talking about one flat visual result repeated endlessly. We're talking about a broad family of pigment-rich irises, all sharing relatively high melanin content, but presenting it in many ways. Brown is a category that covers a great deal of detail, and perhaps that is part of why it gets underestimated. People see the label and miss the variety inside it. This happens with common biological traits all the time. We stop looking closely because recognition arrives too quickly. We think we know the thing, so we do not bother studying it. Brown eyes suffer slightly from that problem in popular imagination. Blue eyes are discussed as unusual. Green eyes are discussed as rare. Hazel eyes are discussed as though they are conducting a personal campaign against classification. Brown eyes are often treated as obvious, but obvious is not the same as simple. A dark brown iris under bright light can reveal warm gradients and fine radial textures that are every bit as intricate as those in lighter eyes. The reason we overlook this is social, not biological. We tend to praise what stands out against the expected background, forgetting that the background itself is usually rich with structure. In family inheritance, the commonness of brown eyes also becomes easier to understand once we stop relying on the old classroom myth that eye colour follows one perfectly simple, dominant recessive rule. It is true that darker eye colour has often been described as genetically dominant over lighter eye colour in simplified teaching models, and those models are not entirely useless as a first introduction. But real eye colour is influenced by multiple genes, not one single switch. Even so, many of the gene variants associated with higher melanin production in the iris are widespread, and across many populations that means brown eyes appear frequently generation after generation. A child inherits not a neat label, but a collection of genetic influences affecting pigment production and iris appearance. Because the ancestral darker pigment framework is so widespread, brown eyes continue to emerge very often. Sometimes families are startled when lighter eyes appear. The surprise makes sense emotionally. Biologically, it simply means the genetic combinations were there. Another piece of the puzzle is that global population numbers matter. Even if lighter eye colours can become quite frequent in certain regions, those regions represent only part of the total human population. Brown eyes remain overwhelmingly common worldwide because the populations in which darker iris pigmentation is prevalent are large and diverse. This is where perspective matters. A person raised in a Northern European setting might grow up feeling that blue or grey eyes are ordinary, and brown eyes somewhat less so, because that is what their local environment shows them. A person raised elsewhere may experience the exact reverse. But when you zoom out to the species level, brown eyes dominate the global picture. That does not make local impressions false. It just means human beings are very good at mistaking the sample in front of them for the whole world, and perhaps that is part of why eye colour carries so much cultural baggage. A trait that feels unusual in one place will gather attention, stories, compliments, and myths. A trait that feels ordinary may slip beneath notice even when it is doing most of the historical heavy lifting. Brown eyes became common not because they are invisible, but because they are ancient in the story of our species. They're tied to the long inheritance of melanin-rich pigmentation, to the continuity of ancestral populations, and to the spread of human beings across environments where darker iris pigmentation remained perfectly compatible with life, vision, and reproduction. They are common because they belong to the deep grammar of human variation, not because biology ran out of imagination. That phrase matters to me, I think, because common human traits are so often treated as blank spaces when they are anything but. Brown eyes are not the absence of rarity, they are the presence of history. Every dark iris carries within it the work of melanocytes, the chemistry of melanin, the inheritance of genes passed down through uncounted generations, and the long continuity of ancestral pigmentation patterns that reach back far beyond memory. That may sound grand for something you can notice in a supermarket queue, but biology is full of grand things hiding in mundane places. The ordinary is often just the ancient wearing comfortable clothes. Once you see it that way, the question shifts slightly. Brown eyes are common because darker pigmentation came first and stayed widespread. Fine. But then the lighter colours become more intriguing, not because they are better or stranger in some mystical way, but because they demand a more specific explanation. If melanin is the main pigment in the iris, and if darker pigmentation is ancestral, then how do blue eyes happen at all? Where does that colour come from if the iris is not using blue pigment in the usual sense? That is the point where the story stops being mainly about common ancestry and starts leaning more heavily on optics. And optics, as it turns out, has a wonderfully mischievous habit of producing blue where no blue pigment exists, which is a very good place for us to go next. Blue eyes are one of those biological facts that seem obvious right up until someone asks you to explain them properly. At first glance, the answer feels almost insultingly simple. They are blue because, well, they are blue. A satisfying little circle of logic, and about as useful as saying bread is bread-coloured because it is made of bread. The moment you try to go one step deeper, the whole thing becomes unexpectedly strange. What exactly is blue in a blue eye? Where is the blue pigment stored? Is there some special dye in the iris, a tiny store of sky-coloured chemistry tucked behind the cornea? And the answer, which still surprises people even after they have heard it once or twice, is no. Blue eyes do not contain blue pigment in the way most people imagine. There is no neat blue colouring agent painting the iris from within. What we see as blue is produced largely by the way light interacts with the tissue of the iris when there is relatively little melanin in its front layers. In other words, blue eyes are blue more because of optics than because of blue material. That sounds suspiciously like science trying to be clever for its own entertainment, but it is a very real and very useful distinction. We are accustomed to thinking of colour as a property that sits inside an object like a permanent label. Red paint is red because it contains red pigment. A green leaf looks green because its pigments absorb some wavelengths of light and reflect others. A yellow raincoat is yellow because someone at some point decided the world needed more yellow raincoats and then acted on that belief. In all of these cases, pigment is doing much of the visible work, so it feels natural to extend that same logic to blue eyes. Surely if an iris looks blue, something in it must be blue. But nature is under no obligation to follow our most convenient assumptions, and visible colour can arise in more than one way. Sometimes it comes from pigment, sometimes it comes from structure. Blue eyes belong largely to the second category. To understand that, we have to return to the iris itself, which is not a flat surface but a layered tissue. In darker eyes, the front layers of the iris contain more melanin, especially eumelanin, which absorbs more incoming light and produces that brown appearance. In lighter eyes, the amount of melanin in the front part of the iris is much lower. That change in pigmentation affects how light behaves when it enters the tissue. Rather than being absorbed to the same extent, more light is scattered. Shorter wavelengths of visible light in the blue part of the spectrum are scattered in a way that makes the iris appear blue to an observer. So the eye is not blue because it contains blue pigment, it is blue because the tissue structure and low pigment conditions favour a scattering effect that makes blue light more prominent in what reaches us. The comparison most often made here is with the sky, and it is a useful one as long as we do not lean on it so hard that it snaps. The sky looks blue, not because the air is full of blue paint, but because molecules in the atmosphere scatter shorter wavelengths of sunlight more efficiently than longer ones. Blue light gets redirected in many directions, and when we look up, that scattered blue light is what reaches our eyes from across the dome of the sky. Something broadly similar is going on in blue eyes. The iris tissue, particularly the stroma in the front layers, scatters light in a way that makes shorter wavelengths more visible when melanin is sparse. So when someone says their eyes are blue, what they are really describing is a structural colour effect produced by light scattering in a lightly pigmented iris. It is a bit like having a small patch of atmospheric physics built into your face, which is a much better arrangement than most of us realise. Now, structural colour is a useful phrase here. In biology, structural colours are colours produced not primarily by pigment, but by microscopic physical structures that interact with light. Some butterfly wings, bird feathers, and beetle shells show brilliant structural colours. They may shimmer or shift because their surfaces manipulate light through layered structures, spacing, and reflection. Human blue eyes are not identical to those flashy examples. but they belong to the same broad principle that colour can emerge from light behaviour rather than from pigment alone. The iris is not iridescent like a hummingbird's throat, thankfully, or ordinary eye contact would become much more difficult to manage, but it is structured enough that when melanin is low, light scattering creates a stable blue appearance. This also explains why blue eyes are not all the same blue. If there were a simple blue pigment doing the job, you might expect blue irises to come in one standard shade, perhaps a neat sensible colour card blue with a serial number and a smug little label. But blue eyes vary enormously. Some are pale and icy, some are deep and slate-like, some lean toward grey. Some seem to contain darker rings or warmer flecks near the pupil. Some look brilliantly blue outdoors and much duller indoors. That variation comes from differences in tissue structure, the exact amount and distribution of melanin that is present, the density of the iris stroma, and the lighting under which the eye is viewed. Blue eyes are not blue because of one identical ingredient repeated millions of times. They are blue because a set of optical conditions can be met in slightly different ways. One particularly important detail is that the back layer of the iris is still heavily pigmented even in blue eyes. This is one of those facts that immediately improves the whole explanation. If the iris were simply empty of pigment altogether, the eye would not look blue in the way it does. The rear pigment layer helps absorb light behind the scattering front layers, shaping the final effect. So blue eyes are not just pigment-free windows. They are lightly pigmented in the front, more pigmented behind, and structured in such a way that incoming light is scattered and reflected before returning outward. This combination produces the blue appearance. It is another reminder that eye colour is always about the whole optical arrangement, not one substance acting alone. Because of this, blue eyes can be a little unstable in appearance from one situation to another. They do not truly change colour in the dramatic sense, but they often seem to. A blue iris in warm indoor light may look muted or greyish. In bright daylight it may suddenly appear much more vivid. Certain clothing colours, especially whites, blues and greys, can increase the perceived contrast and make blue eyes stand out more strongly. A dilated pupil in dim light changes the visible proportion of the iris and can alter how saturated the eye appears. Photographs may exaggerate or flatten the effect depending on exposure, white balance, and whether the photographer has behaved responsibly or has instead decided that every portrait should look like a fantasy novel cover. The point is that blue eyes are particularly sensitive to context because their colour depends so much on the behaviour of light. This sensitivity is one reason people become attached to all sorts of stories about blue eyes being especially expressive or changing with emotion. In truth, emotion can affect pupil size, and pupil size can affect the visible impression of the iris, so there is a small kernel of reality buried under the myth. If someone is excited, frightened, or in love, their pupils may widen, which changes the balance of dark and coloured area in the eye. That may make the blue appear deeper or more striking. But this is not mood-based pigment transformation. Your iris is not taking emotional instructions from your nervous system and choosing between coastal blue and winter steel depending on how the evening is going. It is still the same tissue. It is just being seen under slightly different optical conditions. Another common misunderstanding is the idea that blue eyes must therefore be somehow empty, as though the absence of blue pigment means the eye is missing something essential. But low melanin in the front layers of the iris is not a defect. It is a normal variant of human pigmentation. It simply produces a different visible outcome. Biology does not treat blue eyes as incomplete brown eyes, any more than it treats blonde hair as incomplete black hair. These are variations in pigment production and expression within a species capable of considerable visual diversity. The fact that blue is structural rather than pigment-based does not make it less real. After all, the sky is not less blue because the atmosphere is playing games with light. It is still blue to us, and perception is not a mistake just because physics has a more complicated explanation. There is also a pleasing elegance in the way this explanation links eye colour back to other parts of biology. Once we know that melanin is the main pigment in the iris, the existence of blue eyes makes immediate sense as a case of reduced melanin, rather than the introduction of some completely separate blue chemistry. Nature does not need to invent a new pigment for every visible result. It can generate variety by altering the amount of an existing pigment and letting physical structure do the rest. In darker eyes, higher melanin masks scattering effects and the iris looks brown. In lighter eyes, lower melanin allows those effects to emerge. The same basic biological toolkit produces very different appearances simply by changing proportions. It is a wonderfully economical system, which is typical of evolution. It is not a maximalist decorator. It tends to make clever use of what is already available. This brings us quietly to genetics, though not quite in full yet. Blue eyes exist because genes affecting melanin production and iris development create a condition in which the front of the iris contains relatively little melanin. That does not mean there is one single blue eye gene operating like a cartoon switch, despite the enthusiasm with which school diagrams sometimes imply otherwise. Several genes influence eye color, and their combined effects alter pigment levels and tissue characteristics. In many blue-eyed individuals, certain genetic variants reduce the amount of melanin laid down in the front iris. Once that happens, the optical side of the story takes over. So blue eyes are genetic, yes, but the visible blue itself is physical. Genes set up the tissue. Light creates the appearance. The two parts work together so smoothly that we often mistake the outcome for a simple pigment label. Blue eyes in infants are another case where this optical explanation becomes especially helpful. Some babies are born with eyes that appear blue or bluish-grey, not because they are guaranteed to have blue eyes permanently, but because the melanin production in the iris is still low early in life. As the baby grows, melanocytes in the iris may produce more pigment, and the visible colour may darken into brown, hazel, or green. This often turns family life into a long-running speculative tournament. Every aunt becomes a geneticist, every grandparent has a theory. Somewhere someone insists the child's eyes will stay blue because the shape of the ears confirms it, which is nonsense, but delivered with enormous conviction. The real reason for these early shifts is much simpler. Low melanin allows scattering effects to dominate at first. Increased pigment later changes the optical balance. What looked blue can become something else because the iris was still under construction, biologically speaking. It is also useful to ask why blue eyes sometimes look almost grey. If blue in the iris is a structural effect, then small changes in scattering, pigment amount and lighting can shift the apparent colour toward grey quite easily. Grey eyes are often thought of as a separate category, and in practical terms they can be, but the boundary between grey and blue is not a hard biological wall. It is more like a gradual slope. Some irises scatter light in a way that produces a softer, less saturated effect, and our brains call that grey. Others produce a clearer blue. Still others hover between the two depending on the light, the clothing, the weather, and how argumentative the observer happens to be. So blue eyes exist without blue pigment, and the same basic principle also helps explain why blue is not always the same blue. There is a social side to this too, which is difficult to ignore. Blue eyes have acquired an extraordinary amount of cultural attention in some parts of the world, often out of proportion to their actual biological mystery. They are described as piercing, icy, innocent, intense, angelic, suspicious, or somehow magical, depending on what kind of fiction one has consumed, and whether one has recently fallen in love with an unreliable person in a television series. But much of that fascination comes down to contrast and relative rarity in certain populations. A lightly pigmented iris catches and reflects light in a very noticeable way, especially when surrounded by darker lashes or brows. People notice what stands out, then they write stories around it. Biology itself is more restrained. It says only that low melanin in the iris allows light scattering to create the appearance of blue. All the rest, the poetry, the symbolism, the overconfident personality theories belongs to us. And yet, even stripped of those stories, blue eyes remain genuinely interesting. In fact, I would say they become more interesting once the myth is removed. To know that an iris can appear vividly blue without using blue pigment at all is a lovely reminder that what we see is always the product of interaction, not just substance. Light must arrive, tissue must shape it, the observer must receive it. Blue eyes are a small lesson in the difference between appearance and composition. They look like one thing, but they are made by another. That is not deceptive. It is simply how optics works in a living structure. The same truth appears all over nature if you know where to look. Feathers shimmer without blue dye. Beetle shells flash green without green paint. The sky itself performs blue by scattering. The world is full of colours produced by arrangement rather than by straightforward pigment, and the human iris is one more quiet example. Once you understand that, several myths collapse very neatly. Blue eyes are not blue because of a hidden mineral, not because of a special fluid, not because someone inherited coldness from a Nordic ancestor with excellent cheekbones, and not because the soul is shining through in a cooler tone than average. They are blue because low melanin in the front iris allows light scattering to dominate the visible effect. That explanation may sound less glamorous to someone hoping for enchanted bloodline material, but it has the advantage of being true. And truth, when it comes to the body, is usually stranger than the decorative version anyway. There is one more reason this matters. Once we accept that blue eyes are not a separate pigment category, but an optical consequence of low melanin, the whole map of eye colour begins to look more continuous. Brown, blue, grey, green, hazel, these are not isolated islands with different magical paints. They are related outcomes produced by different balances of melanin, structure and light. Blue is one end of that balance, not an entirely separate invention, and that realisation helps us move into the next cluster of eye colours, which are often the most difficult to define neatly, because if blue can exist without blue pigment, then green, hazel and grey begin to look less like mysterious exceptions and more like intermediate or mixed results in the same beautifully practical system. If blue eyes begin to make sense once you stop hunting for blue pigment and start thinking instead about low melanin, tissue structure and light scattering, then the next group of eye colours becomes much less mysterious as well. Green, hazel, grey, and those shades that seem to avoid commitment altogether are often treated as though they belong to a secret category of more complicated eyes, which in a sense they do, but not because they are magical or chemically exotic. They are complicated because they sit in the middle ground. They are what happens when the eye does not move all the way toward the dark, heavily pigmented end of the spectrum, but does not remain at the very lightly pigmented blue end either. They are intermediate outcomes, mixed outcomes, layered outcomes. They remind us that biology is often clearest at the extremes and most interesting in the middle, where several influences overlap and the neat labels start to wobble. That middle ground is where people's confidence about eye colour usually begins to collapse. Brown, most people feel able to identify. Blue, usually yes. But green, hazel, grey. Suddenly everyone becomes uncertain, and the uncertainty is not foolish. It reflects something real about the trait itself. These eye colours are harder to define because they are not produced by one unique pigment sitting clearly in the iris and announcing its presence like a proper name badge. They emerge from combinations of pigment amount, pigment distribution, tissue structure, and the way light is scattered and reflected. So when two people argue over whether an iris is green or hazel, or grey or blue-grey, they are not necessarily demonstrating poor observational skills. They may simply be confronting a biological reality that does not divide itself into the categories as politely as language would prefer. Green eyes are probably the most famous example of this. People speak of them as though the iris contains green pigment in the same way a leaf contains chlorophyll. But the eye, unhelpfully and beautifully, does not operate like that. There is no special green eye pigment stored in a secret little compartment behind the cornea. Green eyes are generally produced by a relatively low to moderate amount of melanin in the iris, combined with the same sort of light scattering that contributes to blue appearance, plus enough yellowish or brownish tonal influence to shift the result away from blue and toward green. It is less like mixing green paint and more like arranging lighting and material in such a way that green becomes the visible effect. That makes green eyes real, obviously, but real in the optical sense rather than in the paint box sense. This is one reason green eyes can look so different from one person to another. Some are pale and silvery, almost mint-like under certain light. Others are deeper, richer, more olive or moss-toned. Some contain obvious golden flecks. Some appear greener around the outer iris and warmer near the pupil. Some seem almost to disappear into grey on cloudy days, and then return to green in sunlight, as though they have gone for a thoughtful walk and come back with better lighting. These differences arise because green is not one exact biological formula. It is a range of appearances produced when the iris contains enough pigment to soften or alter the blue scattering effect, but not enough to become fully brown. Change the amount of melanin slightly, change its distribution slightly, change the density of the iris stroma slightly, and the result can slide across a whole field of greenish appearances. Hazel eyes occupy an even more unruly position. If green eyes are difficult to describe, hazel eyes sometimes seem to treat description as a personal insult. Hazel is one of those everyday words that functions more like a practical compromise than a strict scientific category. People use it when an eye appears to contain a mixture of green, brown, gold, and sometimes grey, especially when the colours are not spread evenly across the iris. Very often hazel eyes have a brown or amber region near the pupil and a greener or lighter outer area. In other cases, the iris is scattered with flecks, streaks, or radial patterns of different tones. The overall impression changes with distance. Up close, the eye may look like a miniature landscape full of separate shades. From across the room, it may simply read as greenish-brown. In bright daylight, it may lean green. Indoors, it may look light brown. In photographs, it may become whatever the camera has chosen to misrepresent this week. What makes hazel eyes especially slippery is not only the mix of colours, but the unevenness of their arrangement. Brown eyes tend to appear more uniformly pigmented. Blue eyes, though variable, are often more visually coherent as a category. Hazel eyes, by contrast, are frequently patchy in the most attractive and inconvenient way. Pigment may be denser in some parts of the iris and lighter in others. Light scattering may be more evident in the outer regions. Golden flecks may become visible only when the light catches the eye from a certain angle. The eye may look almost green when viewed in shade beside warm-toned clothing, and almost amber when viewed in sun beside something blue. This does not mean hazel eyes are changing their anatomy from hour to hour, which would be deeply alarming and quite difficult to schedule around. It means the optical balance is unusually sensitive to context because the iris contains intermediate pigment levels and mixed structural effects. Grey eyes belong to a similarly ambiguous neighbourhood. People often imagine grey eyes as a separate thing altogether, but in practice, grey sits very close to blue on the biological map. Both generally involve low melanin in the front layers of the iris and colour effects produced largely through light scattering rather than strong pigment absorption. The difference is often one of tone and saturation. Grey eyes tend to appear less vividly blue, less brightly scattered, perhaps softer or more muted depending on the tissue structure and the exact way light is being reflected and dispersed. Some may have a slightly higher density in the iris stroma or subtle pigment characteristics that produce a cooler, more neutral appearance. Others may simply occupy that awkward borderland where one observer says blue, another says grey, and a third says sea-coloured, which is poetic but useless in a medical form. There is something almost meteorological about grey eyes. They can look silvery in one light, slate-coloured in another, nearly blue in the sun, and almost clear in shadow. This is probably why people become a bit theatrical about them. A grey eye in a photograph can look like weather rolling in over a harbour, and no one confronted with that sort of evidence is likely to remain entirely sensible. But once again, the mechanism is not mystical. It is the same broad system of low pigmentation, tissue structure and light behaviour. Grey is not the presence of grey dye. It is a visible result produced by the optical environment of the iris. Like blue and green, it is a colour we perceive because of how light behaves in tissue, not because a grey substance has been applied there by some tiny ocular decorator. This entire middle zone of eye colour becomes easier to understand if we stop asking which pigment corresponds to which shade, and instead ask how much melanin is present, where it is located, and what that arrangement allows light to do. A heavily pigmented iris absorbs more light and looks brown. A very lightly pigmented iris allows blue scattering effects to dominate. Somewhere between those two ends, with moderate pigmentation and varied distribution, you begin to get green, hazel, grey-green, blue-grey, amber-brown, and all the other shades that make family conversations unexpectedly heated. The eye does not need a different pigment for each one. It needs variation in the same pigment system plus the structural properties of living tissue. That is enough to create an entire palette of in-between colours. Amber is worth mentioning here as well, if only because people often confuse it with both light brown and hazel. Amber eyes tend to have a more uniform golden or coppery appearance, sometimes with less of the obvious green mixture that defines many hazel eyes. They are often described as honey-coloured or gold, and while the label can be used loosely in ordinary conversation, the appearance usually reflects a particular balance of pigmentation that gives the iris a warm, luminous look without tipping into standard brown. Again, there is no special amber ink involved. The eye is still working with melanin and light. It is just doing so in a combination that produces a very warm, concentrated tone. This is another example of how eye colour labels are useful but imperfect. They describe visible outcomes, not distinct biological species of iris. The trouble with all these labels is that they suggest sharp boundaries where none really exist. We speak as though green stops and hazel begins at some invisible line, as though blue becomes grey only after filing the necessary paperwork. But biological variation rarely behaves that way. Eye colour is better understood as a continuum with clusters. Certain appearances are common and easy to name, others sit between them. Many eyes carry features associated with more than one category. An iris might be officially listed as green while still containing enough brown around the pupil to make a friend insist it is hazel. Another might be called blue, even though it looks grey most of the winter. Another may appear brown at first glance but reveal olive tones close up. This is not just subjective confusion. It reflects the fact that the underlying biology varies gradually, and our language is trying to place fences across a rolling landscape. One of the clearest ways to see this is to look at an iris under magnification. Up close, the coloured ring of the eye is not smooth or flat. It is textured with fibres, ridges, radial lines, crypts, freckles, rings, and little shifts in density. Pigment is not distributed with the sort of even-handed precision a graphic designer might prefer. Some areas are darker, some are flecked, some are almost translucent. In lighter irises especially, these micro-patterns can strongly affect the visible colour. A golden central ring can warm an otherwise green eye. A dark limbal ring can make a pale iris look more vivid by contrast. Tiny spots of brown can pull blue toward hazel in the observer's impression, even if the overall structure still scatters light in a blue-dominant way. So the colour of an eye is always, to some extent, a summary judgment made by the viewer about a detailed and highly variable surface. Lighting, meanwhile, continues to interfere in the most persistent way. Warm indoor light enhances amber and brown tones, which can make hazel eyes look browner and green eyes look more olive. Cool daylight can strengthen blue and grey impressions. Bright sunlight often reveals flecks and gradients that vanish in dim environments. The angle of the light matters too. So does the size of the pupil, so do surrounding colours. A person wearing a deep green jumper may suddenly receive a number of unsolicited comments about their eye colour, not because their irises have transformed themselves for social advantage, but because the contrast has altered the way other people perceive the eyes. The same face beside a warm terracotta wall might seem to have more gold in it. Human perception is very easily nudged by context, and eye colour, especially in the middle ranges, is a perfect victim of that tendency. This is why people often swear their green or hazel eyes change colour. Strictly speaking, the anatomy usually has not changed at all. The pigment is where it was. The tissue is the same tissue. But the visible balance of reflected and scattered light shifts with conditions, and that can make the eyes appear to change in quite convincing ways. Mood may play a small supporting role by affecting pupil size through the autonomic nervous system. When the pupil widens, the surrounding iris looks different because less of it is visible, and different regions attract attention. When it narrows, more of the iris detail is exposed. Add emotion, indoor lighting, weather, clothing, and an observer who already expects dramatic eye behaviour, and suddenly you have a full myth. The myth is not wholly absurd because it begins with a real observation. The mistake lies in assuming the explanation must be emotional or mystical rather than optical. The fact that these colours are so hard to pin down also tells us something useful about inheritance. If eye colour really were the result of one gene choosing one pigment in one simple way, there would likely be much cleaner categories. But the middle shades reveal that the system is influenced by multiple factors at once. Intermediate pigment levels, uneven distribution, tissue structure, and light scattering properties all suggest a trait shaped by overlapping biological influences rather than one tidy switch. This is where older schoolbook genetics starts to look a bit overconfident. The old story that brown is dominant and blue is recessive gives you the broadest possible outline and then leaves you alone in a room full of hazel-eyed relatives demanding actual answers. Real life quickly becomes more intricate than the diagram, and perhaps that is why these in-between eye colours fascinate people so much. Brown and blue, at least in popular imagination, can be treated like clear types. Green, hazel and grey feel less settled. They seem harder to own with confidence, harder to classify, and therefore somehow more alive. People project all sorts of meaning onto that ambiguity. Green eyes are called mysterious. Hazel eyes are said to change with a mood. Grey eyes are described as unreadable or rare, in a way that often sounds like a line from a second-rate novel. But the fascination arises mostly because these colours display the complexity of the system more openly. They make the underlying biology visible. They show us what happens when pigment, structure and light do not align in the simplest possible way. There is also a strange little social bias here. Because middle-range eye colours are less easy to label, they invite more conversation. A brown eye is often simply called brown and left alone. A blue eye may receive praise for being blue and then also be left alone. A hazel eye starts arguments. A green-grey eye produces long pauses and someone eventually saying, "No, wait, come over here by the window." These colours recruit observers into the process. They require interpretation. And once observers are involved, culture starts adding its own nonsense. This is how perfectly ordinary variations in melanin and light become loaded with stories about temperament, danger, seduction, honesty, artistic soulfulness, and whatever else people feel like attributing to the face, while avoiding the harder work of getting to know the person attached to it. Still, the fact that culture gets carried away should not distract from how biologically elegant these colours are. Green, hazel and grey are not messy exceptions that biology forgot to clean up. They are entirely expected outcomes in a system where one main pigment, living tissue and light interact continuously rather than digitally. They are evidence that the iris is not a flat disc, but a three-dimensional patterned structure with variable melanin content and optical properties. They are also a reminder that human variation often resists the labels we place on it. We name things to feel oriented, but the body is under no obligation to remain inside the names. So when you look at a green eye, or a hazel eye, or one of those pale grey-blue eyes that seem to change their mind between breakfast and dusk, what you're really seeing is an intermediate expression of the same underlying system. There is no special bottle of green, no vial of grey, no separate hazel chemistry waiting backstage. There is melanin present in moderate or uneven amounts. There is tissue structure, especially in the iris stroma. There is light, arriving and scattering and reflecting in ways that shift the visible result. And there is the observer, trying to compress a subtle biological gradient into a single word that will fit on a form. That word may be useful. It may even be accurate enough for ordinary life. But the biology behind it is richer than the label suggests. And once you begin to notice that richness, the obvious next question is not really about colour names at all. It is about why these different pigment levels and patterns arise in the first place. Why one person inherits deep brown while another gets blue-grey with amber flecks. Why siblings can look so different. And why the old one-gene explanation falls apart the moment actual families arrive. Because if the colours between are showing us just how variable the iris can be, then the next layer of the story has to be the genetic machinery shaping that variability from the beginning. Now that the colours themselves have started to make sense, brown with more melanin, blue with less, green and hazel and grey living in that wonderfully inconvenient middle ground, where structure and pigment collaborate in less obvious ways, the next question almost asks itself, fine, we know what eye colour is doing. But how does a person end up with one version rather than another? Why do some families seem to produce generations of dark eyes, with the occasional surprise of blue or green, while others contain such a mix of shades that family photographs look like genetics has been improvising? Why can two brown-eyed parents have a blue-eyed child? Why can siblings look so different? And why did so many of us leave school with the firm impression that eye colour was controlled by one neat little dominant versus recessive rule, only to discover later that actual human beings had not read the same textbook? The short answer is that eye colour is genetic but not simple. That is often the most honest phrase in biology. Genetic but not simple. Many traits in living organisms work that way. There is a heritable pattern. There are genes involved, and yet the outcome is shaped by several interacting factors rather than one tidy switch. Eye colour is one of the classic examples. For a long time, it was often taught in an oversimplified way, because the simplified version was useful for introducing the basic idea of inheritance. Brown was described as dominant, blue as recessive, and students were shown a Punnett square that made the whole thing look satisfyingly orderly. If one parent contributed a brown eye version and the other contributed a blue eye version, brown would win. If both contributed blue, blue would appear. It was clean, memorable, and not entirely wrong at the broadest possible level. The trouble is that real eye colour inheritance in humans is influenced by multiple genes, not just one, and those genes affect pigmentation in the iris through pathways that can produce a much wider range of outcomes than the classroom model suggests. The reason the old model lasted so well is that it does capture one visible pattern people often notice. Darker eyes do tend to be common in many families, and lighter eyes do often seem to emerge when certain variants line up in the right combination. So the simple story has just enough truth in it to feel convincing. But as soon as you look at real families, especially families with hazel, green, grey and mixed ancestry, the edges start to fray. The eye colour world is full of people whose existence is a small insult to that diagram. Not a hostile insult, more of a polite but firm correction. Biology tends to do that. It lets us build useful models, then eventually reminds us that the model is not the organism. To see why eye colour is genetically more complicated, it helps to remember what genes are actually influencing. They are not coding directly for brown or blue, the way a set of buttons might select paint swatches. They are influencing the development of the iris, especially the production, distribution, and regulation of melanin within it. The visible eye colour is an outcome of those developmental processes. So genes affecting melanin synthesis, melanocyte behaviour, iris structure, and related pathways can all contribute to what the eye eventually looks like. That means inheritance is working through biology, not through simple labels. The genes do not hand the iris a colour card and say choose wisely. They shape how much pigment gets made, where it ends up, how tissue develops, and therefore how light will behave when the iris is seen. Two genes come up again and again in discussions of eye colour because they play especially important roles. They are called OCA2 and HERC2, and although their names sound like either laboratory codes or second-rate droids from a science fiction film, they are central to understanding why some eyes are darker and some lighter. OCA2 is involved in pigmentation processes and influences melanin production. Variants affecting its activity can alter how much pigment is produced in the iris. HERC2, meanwhile, contains regulatory elements that affect how strongly OCA2 is expressed. One particular region in HERC2 is especially well known because changes there can reduce OCA2. Activity in the iris, leading to lower melanin levels and increasing the likelihood of blue eyes. This is one reason blue eyes are so often discussed in genetic terms, not because there is a single blue eye gene, but because certain variants in the regulatory machinery influencing OCA2 have a strong visible effect. That point about regulation matters enormously. Many people imagine genes as isolated instructions for visible traits, but often genes influence traits indirectly by turning other genes up or down, at the right place, in the right tissue, at the right time. Eye colour is a lovely example of that. You can inherit a variant not because it contains blue, but because it affects the activity of a pigment-related pathway in the iris. Lower activity means less melanin in the front layers. Less melanin means more visible light scattering. More scattering means blue appearance. The chain is elegant once you see it, but it is not the same as a one-step command. This is one reason modern genetics feels so different from schoolroom genetics. It replaces the cartoon simplicity of trait buttons with a quieter, more realistic system of regulation, interaction, and development. And OCA2 and HERC2 are not alone. Several other genes have been implicated in eye colour variation as well, including genes involved in melanin synthesis, pigment transport, melanocyte biology, and tissue characteristics. Some have relatively small effects, some larger ones, and together they create a spectrum rather than a binary. This is especially important for intermediate eye colours like green and hazel, which are hard to explain under a one-gene model. If only one gene mattered, we would expect much cleaner categories. Instead, we see a range of pigment amounts and patterns, suggesting that many inherited influences are blending and interacting. In genetics, this kind of situation is often described as polygenic, meaning influenced by multiple genes. Eye colour is not the most polygenic trait in the human body by any means, but it's far more polygenic than the old classroom story admitted. This also explains why siblings can differ so much. Full siblings inherit genes from the same two parents, but not the same combination. Each parent carries two copies of many genes, and which versions get passed on to each child varies. Add multiple relevant genes into the picture, plus regulatory differences, and suddenly it becomes perfectly reasonable for one sibling to have dark brown eyes, another hazel, and another blue or grey. Families are not produced by photocopier, they are produced by reshuffling. That reshuffling becomes even more dramatic when the parents themselves carry mixed combinations of pigmentation-related variants. A person with brown eyes may still carry variants associated with lower melanin production, even if those variants are not obvious in their own appearance. Pass the right combination to a child alongside the other parent's variants, and an unexpectedly light-eyed child can appear. Unexpected to the family perhaps, not especially unexpected to genetics. This is why the old claim that two brown-eyed parents cannot have a blue-eyed child is not reliable. It can happen. Not under every combination, certainly, but it is entirely possible if both parents carry variants that reduce iris pigmentation and pass the relevant combination on. The simplified dominant recessive framework makes this seem like an exception or a contradiction, when really it's just a reminder that more than one gene is involved. In practical terms, brown-eyed parents may each carry genetic influences for lower melanin in the iris, without displaying that outcome themselves, especially if they also carry variants promoting greater pigmentation. When those influences align in a child, blue eyes can emerge. The family is then invited to enjoy a brief period of confused discussion, unnecessary suspicion, and one relative insisting the answer lies in a great-grandparent from somewhere windy. Green and hazel eyes make the limitations of the simple model even clearer. These colours are not easy to classify under a strict brown versus blue story, because they often reflect intermediate amounts of melanin, uneven pigment distribution, and tissue structures that produce mixed optical effects. Their inheritance is correspondingly complex. A child may inherit combinations of variants that do not lead to very high melanin or very low melanin, but to something in between. The result may be green, hazel, grey-green, or some other shade that forces adults into the window light debate I mentioned before. These outcomes are exactly what you would expect from a trait controlled by several genes with overlapping effects. The genetics do not produce only extremes, they produce gradients. Of course, genes do not operate in a vacuum. They work during development in cells, in tissues, over time. That matters because what is inherited is not simply an eye colour, but a developmental tendency. The genes influence how the iris forms and how much pigment its cells produce. This is why the final, visible colour can take time to settle in infancy. A baby may inherit variants that will eventually support darker eye colour, but melanin production in the iris may still be relatively low at birth. Over months or years, as melanocytes become more active and pigment accumulates, the apparent colour changes, so genetics sets the range of likely outcomes, but the visible result unfolds through development. That is another excellent reason not to treat genes like immediate labels. They are instructions within a process, not stickers on the finished product. Ancestry also shapes what combinations are likely to occur. Certain eye colour-related variants are more common in some populations than others, which is why blue and green eyes are much more frequent in parts of Europe and among people of European ancestry, while brown eyes remain overwhelmingly common worldwide. This does not mean ancestry determines eye colour in a neat predictive way for every individual, because families mix and gene combinations travel. But it does affect probabilities. If a population has historically carried a higher frequency of variants associated with lower melanin production in the iris, lighter eyes will tend to appear more often. If those variants are less common, brown eyes will tend to dominate. So when people talk casually about eye colour running in the family or coming from that side, there is often a loose truth underneath it, though not always in the dramatic or absolute way they imagine. There is also a temptation to assume that because eye colour is genetic, it must be perfectly predictable. But genetics is often more like forecasting than certainty, especially for traits influenced by multiple genes. You can identify likely outcomes, possible outcomes, and improbable outcomes, but not always guarantee the exact shade an infant will grow into. This is one reason those online baby eye colour calculators are best treated as entertainment with a veneer of confidence. They may capture broad probabilities, especially for clearly dark or clearly light parental eye colours, but they are rarely equipped to do justice to the full complexity of the trait. Add hazel, green, mixed ancestry, or uncertain family history, and the prediction rapidly becomes part science, part family folklore, part weather report written by a very optimistic person. Interestingly, even identical twins who share the same DNA sequence to a very high degree may show tiny differences in eye appearance. Not usually radically different colour categories, no, but subtle differences in patterning, flecks, limbal ring prominence or exact shade can occur. That is because development is not only genetically guided but also physically embodied. Tissues form in real time, cells move, pigment is deposited in fine patterns, and no two living structures are laid down with machine-level precision. The genome provides the framework, but the iris still develops as tissue, not as a printed badge. This is a useful reminder that genetics explains a great deal without explaining every microscopic detail of a trait's final presentation. The patterning within the iris is especially revealing in that way. Even when two people share the same general eye colour category, the exact arrangement of flecks, streaks, rings, and pigmentation can differ enormously. Those fine features are not all reducible to one simple inherited code. Some reflect the broader genetic architecture of the iris, certainly, but some arise from the natural variation of development. This is one reason iris recognition can be used as a biometric method. The iris is not just coloured. It is textured and individually patterned in a way that is remarkably distinctive. So genetics gives you the palette and the overall tendency, but development paints the exact pattern with a degree of variation that makes each iris its own little signature. Another piece of confusion comes from the word dominant. People hear that brown is dominant over blue, and imagine that dominance means stronger, more common, better, or somehow more genetically forceful in a grand, almost military sense. That is not what dominance means in genetics. Dominance refers to how one variant's effect appears in relation to another in a particular context. It is a technical relationship, not a rank of nobility. And because eye colour is influenced by multiple genes, even that simple, dominant recessive language becomes less useful than many people expect. Some variants do have stronger visible effects than others, especially those linked to higher pigment production, but the final trait still emerges from a network of influences. So eye colour genetics is a very good place to retire the habit of treating genetic terms as personality traits in disguise. If all of this sounds a bit less tidy than the old school version, that is because it is. But it is also much more satisfying. The simple model gave us categories. The real model gives us explanations. It lets us understand why eye colour can run in families without obeying cartoon rules. It explains why lighter eyes can emerge unexpectedly, why hazel is hard to predict, why siblings differ, and why ancestry shapes frequency without fixing destiny. It also links eye colour to the broader truth that most visible human traits are not controlled by a single lever. They emerge from systems of genes, regulation, development, tissue structure, and environment, all playing their part without ever stopping to produce a chart simple enough for a school worksheet. What I like most about the genetics of eye colour, though, is how quickly it humbles our appetite for certainty. We want inheritance to be neat because neat inheritance feels fair and understandable. You get this from your mother, that from your father, and the body arranges itself like a well-run library. But actual inheritance is more like a library after hours, with a very complicated filing system and several people returning books to the wrong shelves. It still works. It just does not work by obvious surface logic. Eye colour feels simple because we see it as a label. Genetics makes it strange again by showing us all the unseen variation underneath. And once genetics enters the picture properly, one last question starts to press forward. If eye colour is shaped by developmental pathways, and if the visible result depends on melanin in the iris, then can that result ever change after birth? Can eye colour shift over time? Can a baby's eyes darken? Can an adult's appear different with age, health, or environment? People ask those questions constantly, partly because they genuinely notice changes, and partly because humans are very fond of believing their own eyes are more dramatic than average. Some of those changes are perfectly normal, some are optical, some deserve more attention. But to sort them out, we have to follow the story from inheritance into time, because the genes may set the framework, yet the iris still has a life of its own as a living tissue, moving through childhood, adulthood, and everything that comes after. Once genetics has done its quiet work and the iris has developed into the colour a person comes to think of as simply my eyes, it is very tempting to imagine the matter is settled forever. Brown stays brown, blue stays blue, green remains green in that slightly theatrical way green eyes always seem to manage. End of story. But the body is rarely quite that static, and the eye, for all the myths wrapped around it, is still living tissue. It grows, matures, responds, ages, and occasionally changes in ways both ordinary and surprising. So the question of whether eye colour can change over time turns out to be one of those deceptively simple questions, with several different answers hiding inside it. Yes, eye colour can change in some circumstances. No, it usually does not transform dramatically from one category to another in healthy adults. Yes, babies often change. Yes, lighting changes our perception constantly. Yes, age can alter the appearance of the iris. And yes, there are medical conditions and treatments that can affect colour too, though not in the charming, cinematic way people sometimes imagine. The most familiar and perfectly ordinary example is infancy. Many babies are born with eyes that appear blue, grey-blue, or otherwise lighter than the shade they will eventually have. This is especially common in infants with lower initial melanin in the iris at birth. At that stage, the melanocytes in the iris may not yet have produced their full amount of pigment. As those cells become more active over the first months or years of life, melanin builds up, and the visible eye colour may darken. A baby who starts out with pale bluish eyes may later develop hazel, green, or brown eyes, depending on the inherited genetic instructions guiding pigment production. Families often watch this process as though the child was slowly revealing the answer to a small and beloved mystery. There is a surprising amount of emotional investment in it, really. Adults who would never voluntarily discuss enzyme regulation or melanocyte activity suddenly become extremely attentive to afternoon window light and the precise eye shades of distant cousins. But the biology underneath the suspense is straightforward enough. Low melanin early on can produce a lighter appearance. Increased melanin over time alters that optical balance. This is one of the clearest reminders that eye colour is not just a label stamped into place at birth. It is the visible result of tissue conditions, and those conditions can develop over time. That is true not only in infancy, but, more subtly, throughout life. The major infant shift is simply the most obvious case because the baseline can change so much in a relatively short period. A baby's eye colour may settle by the end of the first year, or it may continue shifting more gradually for longer. There is no universal moment when the iris declares itself finished and signs the paperwork. Development is not quite so theatrical. It proceeds at its own pace, and the visible result depends on how much melanin accumulates and how the iris structure matures. Once the eyes have settled into their adult appearance, major natural colour changes become much less common. This is where people are often half right in a slightly inconvenient way. Adults do sometimes feel that their eyes have changed over the years, and sometimes they are noticing something real. But usually what has changed is not the basic eye colour category in the dramatic sense. More often the shift is subtle. The eyes may appear a little lighter, a little duller, a little greyer, or a little less sharply contrasted than they did in youth. Part of this may be due to age-related changes in the iris and surrounding tissues. Pigmentation patterns can alter slightly over time, and the textures of the eye, along with the way light interacts with them, may change. So an adult who says, "My eyes used to be a richer brown," or "My blue eyes seem greyer than they were when I was younger," may not be inventing the whole thing. The eye is not frozen in amber. It is living anatomy moving through age. That said, the most dramatic stories people tell about their adult eye colour changing tend to be less about the iris transforming and more about perception shifting. Lighting remains one of the great tricksters in this subject. A person who sees their eyes under warm bathroom lights, cold daylight, laptop glow, autumn sun, and restaurant candle light is effectively viewing the same iris through a whole rotating gallery of optical circumstances. Lighter and mixed eyes especially can seem to vary enormously from one setting to another. Hazel eyes may look brown indoors and green outside. Grey eyes may appear blue against a white shirt and nearly silver beside black clothing. Even dark brown eyes can seem almost black in low light, and then unexpectedly honeyed when the sun catches them. When people say their eyes change colour all the time, what they often mean is that the visible effect changes all the time. That is not trivial. It is a real visual experience. But it is not the same thing as the pigment profile of the iris being rewritten from afternoon to evening. Pupil size contributes to this illusion more than many people realise. The pupil expands and contracts constantly in response to light, emotion, attention, and other physiological states. In dim conditions or during emotional arousal, the pupil widens. In bright conditions, it narrows. Because the pupil sits in the centre of the iris, changing its size alters how much of the iris is visible and which zones draw the eye most strongly. If a person has a golden ring around the pupil or uneven pigmentation toward the centre, a larger or smaller pupil may change how prominent those regions appear. That can make the whole iris look different even though nothing about the actual pigment has changed. Add to that the fact that emotions can affect pupil size, and you get the very durable myth that eyes change colour with mood. The truth is a little more practical. Mood may alter the pupil. The pupil alters the visual presentation of the iris. The observer decides the colour has changed. Biology, meanwhile, carries on in silence. There is also the matter of surrounding contrast. Makeup, clothing, hair colour, even skin tone altered by sun exposure or winter paleness can influence how the iris is perceived. Someone with hazel eyes may receive comments about them looking greener while wearing olive or forest tones. A blue-eyed person may seem suddenly more vivid beside a warm orange background. A person with very dark eyes may have them look softer or deeper, depending on whether the whites of the eyes appear bright and clear, whether the lashes are emphasized, and whether the scene is flooded with sunlight or flattened by artificial light. Human colour perception is highly context-sensitive. We do not judge eye colour in isolation like laboratory instruments. We judge it within a whole face, in a particular light, through all the biases of contrast and expectation. So a good deal of eye colour change is really the observer's perception responding to context. Still, there are genuine physical changes that can occur in the iris over time, and some of them are entirely normal. As people age, the iris may undergo subtle structural or pigment-related changes. In some individuals, the colour may become a little lighter, or lose some of its earlier intensity. This may be due to changes in pigment density, tissue health, or the broader way aging affects ocular structures. The eye is part of the body, and like the rest of the body, it does not remain exactly the same from infancy to old age. Hair can grey, skin can change texture, and the iris too may shift in its visible quality. These changes are usually gradual and modest, not the sort of transformation that startles family members into dropping teacups. But they are another reason why the honest answer to the question is yes, eye colour can change, though usually not in the dramatic storybook manner people imagine. Some changes are more localised. Certain people develop pigment spots or freckles on the iris over time. These may be harmless and simply reflect localised areas of increased pigmentation. The iris is not always perfectly uniform, and small pigment variations may become more noticeable with age. That does not mean every spot is nothing to worry about, of course. The eye is one of those places where new visible changes deserve respect rather than casual shrugging. But the broader point is that the iris can acquire or reveal small differences over time, without the whole eye-changing category. A blue eye may develop a bit more visible flecking. A brown eye may show more contrast between central and outer regions. A hazel iris may look more golden in middle age than it did in youth. The eye remains recognisably itself while still altering in detail. Then there are medical and pharmacological causes of change, and here the conversation becomes more serious. Some medications can affect iris pigmentation. Certain prostaglandin analog eye drops, often used to treat glaucoma, are a well-known example. In some people, prolonged use can increase brown pigmentation in the iris, particularly in eyes that are lighter or mixed in colour to begin with. This change may be gradual but can become permanent. It is not the eye deciding to reinvent itself aesthetically. It is a chemical effect on pigment-producing cells and related pathways. This is one of the clearest examples of adult eye colour genuinely changing through altered biology rather than mere perception. Inflammation, injury, and disease can also affect iris colour. If the iris is damaged, if inflammation changes the tissue, or if certain ocular conditions alter pigmentation, the eye may look different. Sometimes the change affects one eye more than the other, which can make it especially noticeable. Conditions involving pigment dispersion, inflammation of the eye, trauma, or structural changes may all influence appearance. This is not the place for a long medical catalogue, and in truth it would spoil the calm of the evening rather badly, but it does matter to say plainly that new or noticeable changes in adult eye colour, especially when they affect only one eye or are accompanied by pain, vision changes, redness, or other symptoms, are worth professional attention. The eye is too important an organ to treat visible changes as a quirky little plot twist and move on. There is also heterochromia, which people often discover partway through life even if it has been present for years. Heterochromia simply means a difference in coloration. One eye may be a different colour from the other, or one part of an iris may differ from another part. Some people are born with it. Others acquire it later through injury, disease, or medication effects. Central heterochromia, where the area around the pupil differs in colour from the outer iris, is often harmless and simply part of a person's natural pigmentation pattern. Many people do not even realise they have it until someone points it out, or a high-resolution photograph catches the detail. This can create the impression that the eyes have changed when in fact the pattern was always there, and only now has been noticed properly. Human beings miss a surprising amount about their own faces until a phone camera becomes just intrusive enough. Another subtle factor is that the eye around the iris changes too. The cornea, the tear film, the sclera, the lens, and the general clarity of ocular tissues all influence how the iris appears to an observer. If the whites of the eyes are bloodshot, yellowed, or dull, the contrast with the iris changes. If the tear film is dry or the surface is irritated, the eye may appear less bright and reflective. Age-related changes in the lens can affect how the eye is seen, especially in close observation or photography. None of this means the iris itself has dramatically changed colour, but it reminds us again that what we call eye colour is always a visual impression of a living system, not a flat sample of paint mounted under museum lighting. This is part of why photographs are such unreliable witnesses. People often compare old photos with new ones and conclude that their eye colour has changed. Sometimes that is true in infancy or with age or medication. Very often, though, the comparison is flawed from the start. Different cameras handle colour differently. White balance shifts, exposure changes, shadows alter the saturation of the iris. Flash can flatten or exaggerate pigmentation. A lightly pigmented eye photographed in bright outdoor light may look almost icy. The same eye photographed indoors under yellow light may look muddy or grey. Even the direction in which a person is looking matters, because the iris catches light differently depending on angle, so the apparent evidence of change may be mostly photographic mischief. Cameras, like human memory, are persuasive without always being trustworthy. It is also worth addressing one of the more persistent bits of folklore, namely the claim that emotional or spiritual development can alter eye colour in adults. People sometimes say their eyes became greener after a life change, darker after grief, lighter after a diet, clearer after meditation, or more golden after deciding to become the sort of person who drinks herbal infusions before 8 a.m. I do not say this to mock anyone. Bodies do change and people do notice themselves closely during meaningful transitions, but there is no sound biological basis for large, ordinary, adult eye colour shifts based purely on mood, personality, or personal growth. What may have changed is lighting, style, pupil behaviour, surrounding features, or simply the observer's attention. The story feels emotionally true, which is often why it survives. Biology, however, remains stubbornly tied to tissue, pigment, and optics. That stubbornness can be oddly comforting. It means the eye is not a mystical mood ring constantly revising its identity according to the week's emotional weather. It is a structured organ, reliable in its basic mechanisms, subtle in its appearance, and responsive in limited, understandable ways. Babies change because development is still underway. Adults may experience modest shifts because tissue ages or pigment changes slightly. Medications and medical conditions can alter colour more substantially. Lighting and pupil size produce endless apparent change without rewriting the iris itself. All of these fit neatly once you remember what eye colour actually is, the visible effect of melanin, structure and light in living tissue. And perhaps the most useful distinction of all is between true pigment change and apparent colour change. True change involves something biological in the iris itself shifting over time, whether because melanin increases during infancy, pigment patterns alter with age, or medication affects melanocyte behaviour. Apparent change, by contrast, happens when the same iris is seen under different optical or perceptual conditions. Both are real experiences, both matter to the person looking in the mirror, but they are not the same kind of event. One is the body changing, the other is the body being seen differently. The whole subject becomes much calmer the moment those two possibilities are separated. There is something almost philosophical hiding in that distinction, though I will try not to become unbearable about it. We tend to assume that if something looks different, it must have become different. But biology and perception do not always agree so neatly. The iris is a perfect example. Its visible colour is not a fixed paint chip, but an effect created in real time by light meeting tissue. That means constancy and variation are both present at once. The structure may be the same, yet the appearance shifts. The pigment may be stable, yet the impression changes. The person says, "My eyes look different today," and in one sense that is absolutely true. In another sense, almost nothing has changed at all. So can eye colour change over time? Yes, very commonly in babies, sometimes subtly across adulthood and aging, occasionally more noticeably because of medication, injury or disease, and all the time in appearance, as lighting, pupil size, contrast and perception continue their small tricks. The better question, perhaps, is not whether the eyes can change, but what kind of change we mean. Because once we understand that distinction, we are much less likely to confuse development with mystery or optics with destiny. And that brings us naturally to another version of the same misunderstanding, one that has probably been waiting in the room since the beginning. People do not just ask whether eye colour changes. They ask what it means. They ask whether brown eyes mean one personality and blue another, whether green eyes signal rarity in some deeper sense, whether hazel eyes reveal complexity, whether darker eyes suggest certain abilities or lighter eyes certain weaknesses. In other words, once the body shows a visible difference, human beings rush to attach stories to it. Some of those stories are harmless, some are cultural, some are flattering nonsense. A few brush against real biology, but to sort that out, we have to leave the mechanics for a moment and confront the larger claim directly, which is not how eye colour works, but what people believe it says about the person wearing it. By the time people ask what eye colour means, they are usually no longer asking about melanin or scattering or regulatory genes. They are asking something much older and much more human. They are asking whether the visible differences in our faces carry hidden information about who we are, not just how the eye formed, but what kind of person is standing behind it. Does brown mean warm? Does blue mean calm, or sharp, or somehow colder? Does green mean rare in a deeper sense than statistics? Does hazel suggest complexity, changeability, mystery, some private weather system of the soul? Human beings have been making these leaps for a very long time. We notice a trait, we attach a feeling to it, then before long the feeling hardens into a story. The story gets repeated often enough that it begins to sound like common sense. Eye colour has collected more than its fair share of those stories. This is not difficult to understand. Eyes matter intensely in social life. We look at them when we meet someone, when we judge whether they are paying attention, when we try to decide whether they are friendly, tired, amused, lying, bored, or hoping this conversation ends soon. The face is our main social surface, and the eyes sit at its centre like little magnets for interpretation. So when eye colour varies, even slightly, people notice, and once people notice, they start inventing meaning. The process is almost automatic. A rare trait becomes special. A common trait becomes dependable. A striking contrast becomes intense. A softer one becomes gentle. None of this requires evidence in the strict biological sense. It only requires a pattern-catching brain and enough confidence to narrate what it thinks it has found. That is why so many eye colour myths sound emotionally plausible even when they are scientifically flimsy. Brown eyes are said to be warm, grounded, loyal, reassuring. Blue eyes are described as piercing, cool, innocent, distant, or severe depending on the observer's taste and personal history. Green eyes attract an astonishing amount of language that makes them sound as though they belong either to forest spirits or people who would absolutely win an argument and then remember it for years. Hazel eyes are often described as changeable, hard to read, moody in a glamorous way. Grey eyes are granted a kind of weather-based mystique, as though the owner must know secrets and possibly own a coat with an impressive collar. These ideas persist because they are flattering, vivid, and easy to remember. They give the illusion that visible difference equals psychological difference. But biology is under no obligation to support our storytelling habits. The simplest and most important point here is this: eye colour does not tell you a person's character. It does not reveal whether they are kind, intelligent, trustworthy, emotionally deep, manipulative, loyal, artistic, or unusually good at remembering where they left their keys. There is no reliable biological pathway by which the amount of melanin in the iris becomes a measure of moral quality or inner nature. The genes influencing eye colour affect pigmentation and development in the eye. They are not secret personality runes painted into the face. This sounds obvious when stated bluntly, and yet people resist it because the alternative is so tempting. We want shortcuts. We like to imagine that appearance offers readable clues. It makes the world feel less uncertain. If faces can be decoded, then perhaps strangers become a little less strange. Of course, that desire for readable faces goes well beyond eye colour. Human beings have repeatedly tried to draw conclusions about personality, intelligence, criminality, virtue and destiny from visible features. Most of those efforts have aged badly, and deservedly so. They tend to reveal much more about human bias than about human biology. Eye colour belongs to that same family of mistaken certainty when it is treated as a sign of character. One culture may romanticize one shade, another may treat it with suspicion. One period may associate dark eyes with passion and light eyes with innocence. Another may reverse the script entirely. These patterns tell us that the meaning of eye colour is often cultural rather than biological. The same trait can be admired, distrusted, eroticized, or ignored depending on the place and time. That should already make us suspicious of any claim that the meaning lies naturally inside the iris itself. Even when people speak more casually, with no intention of advancing a grand theory, they still slip into this habit. Someone says, "He has honest brown eyes," or "She has icy blue eyes," and the language feels natural because the eye colour is being folded into the emotional reading of the face. But what is really being described there is an impression, not a fact located in the iris. The face, expression, lighting, and observer's expectations are all doing the work. Brown eyes may seem warm in part because brown is a familiar, dark, visually soft tone in many lighting conditions. Blue eyes may seem striking because the contrast can be strong, especially against certain skin and hair combinations. Green eyes may attract attention because they are relatively uncommon in many populations, and uncommon traits are often granted extra symbolic importance simply because they interrupt expectation. We notice the interruption, then we start writing psychological fiction around it. This does not mean eye colour means nothing at all. It means different things in different contexts, and some of those meanings are biological while others are social inventions. If we are being careful, eye colour can mean something about pigmentation. It can mean something about how much melanin is present in the iris and how the tissue handles light. It can sometimes hint, broadly and imperfectly, at ancestry or population history. It can have minor implications for light sensitivity in some individuals, because lighter irises generally contain less pigment. It can matter in medicine when a change in colour reflects a developmental process, a medication effect, an injury, or a disease state. Those are real meanings. They belong to the body. But the leap from those meanings to this colour means this kind of person is not supported in the same way. That leap belongs to folklore, stereotype, and human imagination. Ancestry is perhaps the most reasonable place where people look for meaning, though even here caution helps. Certain eye colours are more common in some populations than others. Brown eyes are overwhelmingly common worldwide and closely tied to the ancestral darker pigmentation pattern in humans. Blue and green eyes are more frequent in parts of Europe and among people with significant European ancestry. So yes, eye colour can sometimes hint at broad ancestry patterns, but it is a clue, not a certificate. Human populations have mixed for thousands of years. Families carry surprising combinations. A person may inherit eye colour that reflects only one thread in a much larger family history. To treat eye colour as a precise ancestry test would be a mistake. It can suggest patterns in the roughest sense, but it cannot tell the whole story of a person's background by itself. There is also the question of rarity, which people often confuse with meaning. Green eyes, for example, are frequently described as special because they are less common globally than brown eyes. That much is statistically true in broad terms, but rarity is not a personality trait. It is not a moral or psychological quality. It simply means fewer people have that visible outcome. A rare eye colour may attract more attention, and attention often gets misread as significance. If strangers comment on a trait more often, it can begin to feel as though the trait says something deep. But all it really says at first is that it stands out relative to expectation. Brown eyes, being common worldwide, may receive fewer dramatic speeches from strangers, but that does not make them less expressive, less beautiful, or less meaningful in any human sense that matters. Frequency is a statistical description, not a value system. What eye colour definitely does not mean is destiny. It does not predict what sort of partner someone will be, whether they are ambitious, whether they are emotionally guarded, whether they will excel at mathematics, whether they are likely to cheat at cards, or whether they have an old soul. I mention the last one because eyes are very often recruited into the language of soulfulness. People look into someone's face, feel moved for reasons that may have to do with expression, attraction, tenderness, fatigue, or context, and then attribute the feeling to the eye colour itself. This is understandable. We're not wrong to experience people as visually powerful. The error comes when we confuse our response with a biological property of the iris. Eye colour can shape first impressions because human perception is impressionable. That is not the same thing as eye colour reliably encoding the traits we imagine. There is a slightly more subtle version of the same mistake that appears in pop scientific claims. Every so often, eye colour gets linked in casual writing to pain tolerance, athletic ability, sensitivity, alcohol tolerance, learning style, or some other trait that sounds just plausible enough to travel. A study is mentioned. A headline gets simplified. Soon people are announcing that brown-eyed people do this and blue-eyed people do that. The problem with these claims is not only that many are weak, oversold, or inconsistent. It is that visible traits tempt us into treating broad averages, if they exist at all, as personal truths. Even if a statistical association is observed somewhere, that does not mean eye colour becomes a meaningful guide to the individual standing in front of you. Biology works in populations and probabilities as well as in individuals, and the jump from one to the other is where people usually lose the thread. More broadly, if eye colour carries any social meaning, It is usually meaning that other people project onto it. That distinction matters. A trait can shape how others react to you without actually shaping who you are inside. A child with very light eyes in a place where light eyes are uncommon may receive more comments, more attention, perhaps even different assumptions from adults. Another child with dark brown eyes in a place where that is the local norm may pass through those same social moments differently, not because the eye colour has changed the child's character, but because it has changed the responses of others. Human beings are constantly responding to visible traits, often without realising it. So when eye colour seems to mean something in social life, it may mean something about bias, expectation, beauty standards, or familiarity rather than about the person's actual nature. This is true in attraction too, where people are especially fond of pretending their preferences are revelations of cosmic truth. Someone insists they have always been drawn to green eyes. Another swears brown eyes feel safer or warmer. Someone else claims blue eyes unsettle them or fascinate them. These preferences can be real as experiences, but they are still preferences shaped by culture, memory, early experience, local rarity, and countless other influences. They are not evidence that one eye colour carries objective emotional content. A dark brown eye can look impossibly gentle in one face and intimidating in another. A blue eye can seem open or distant depending on expression. Hazel eyes can feel soft or electric. Much of what we think we see in eye colour is being created by the whole face, the whole person, and our own history as observers. That does not make the experience trivial. First impressions are real. Attraction is real. Symbolism is real. Poetry, portraiture, cinema, and storytelling have all made use of eye colour because it can change the emotional texture of a face. But there is a difference between artistic meaning and biological meaning. Art is free to turn eyes into symbols of oceans, forests, storms, hearths, winter, or danger. Biology is more restrained. Biology asks only how much pigment is present, how the tissue formed, how the light is scattered, what the genes are doing, and whether the eye is healthy. The rest belongs to us, and it is probably healthier when we admit that it belongs to us rather than pretending the iris itself wrote the script. There are, however, a few ways eye colour can relate to the body beyond appearance. Lighter eyes may be more sensitive to bright light in some people, because the iris contains less pigment to absorb stray light. This does not mean every blue-eyed person lives in permanent distress at the sight of a sunny pavement, nor does it mean every dark-eyed person is immune to glare. It simply means pigmentation can influence the optical behaviour of the eye. In medicine, eye colour can also matter because certain conditions, syndromes, or medication effects involve changes in iris pigmentation. In that setting, meaning becomes clinical. A difference in eye colour between two eyes, a new pigment change, or a visible alteration over time may tell a doctor something relevant. That is one of the few places where the question, "What does it mean?" has a practical and evidence-based answer. The irony is that the most useful meanings are usually the least romantic ones. Then there is the question of identity, which is perhaps the gentlest and most defensible sort of meaning. Eye colour can become part of how a person understands their own face. It can connect them to family resemblance. Someone may say they inherited their mother's eyes or their grandfather's colouring. A mixed eye colour may become a beloved family trait. A dark brown iris may be a marker of continuity across generations. A child may grow up hearing that their eyes look like someone long gone and carry that association for life. This kind of meaning is not biological in the narrow mechanistic sense, but it is still real. Human beings live partly in stories, and visible features often become anchors for memory, kinship, and belonging. The key difference is that this sort of meaning does not claim the eye colour determines the person's inner character. It simply lets the trait participate in family and identity. That is perhaps the better way to think about it. Eye colour can mean something in history, in memory, in resemblance, in population patterns, in clinical observation, in the aesthetics of a face. What it cannot honestly mean is that a person's psychology or moral worth has been written into the iris. The eye is important, yes. Its colour is noticeable, yes. But the temptation to turn a visible trait into a character summary is one of the oldest mistakes we make about one another. It saves time, and that is exactly why it's so attractive. Real people take longer to know. Eye colour, by contrast, arrives in a glance. This is also why eye colour stereotypes tend to survive even when they are nonsense. They are efficient. Brown equals warm, blue equals cold, green equals mysterious, hazel equals unpredictable. It is fast, memorable, and emotionally satisfying. It also spares the observer from uncertainty. Once the label is attached, the person feels slightly more legible. But human beings are not that legible. A kind face can belong to a selfish person. A severe-looking face can belong to someone generous and funny. A pair of luminous light eyes can hide boredom, kindness, panic, tenderness, or a grocery list. The iris has not changed. The meaning was never there to begin with. And yet, I do not think the answer should be coldly dismissive, because part of the reason people ask what eye colour means is that they are really asking whether visible differences in the body matter. They do. They matter socially. They matter historically. They matter to art and attraction and memory. They matter to medicine in certain contexts. They matter in how we are noticed and described. What they do not do is reduce a person to an essence. The meaning is not fixed in the biology the way people hope. It emerges in layers. Some layers belong to the body, some belong to culture, some belong to the observer. Keeping those layers separate is the only way not to get lost. There is also something freeing in that. If eye colour does not tell the world who you are, then you are not trapped inside other people's mythology about your face. Brown eyes do not sentence you to being the reliable one. Blue eyes do not make you remote. Green eyes do not make you enchanted, difficult, seductive, or morally complicated. Hazel eyes do not commit you to a lifetime of seeming emotionally weather-dependent. The body contains variation. The mind contains personhood. They are connected because one person lives inside both, but one is not a coded summary of the other. So what does eye colour mean then, if we say it as honestly as possible? It means your iris contains a certain amount and arrangement of melanin. It means your development and inherited genes produced a particular optical result. It may mean something about family resemblance or broad ancestry. It may influence how others notice you. It may affect how your eyes behave in bright light. It may occasionally matter to a doctor. Beyond that, most of the meaning is written by human culture, human attraction, and human imagination. Beautifully written sometimes, ridiculously written, often, but written by us all the same. And once that is clear, another question becomes much easier to approach. If eye colour does not secretly reveal the soul, what does it reveal about the actual working eye? Does a lighter iris behave differently in light? Does a darker iris handle brightness differently? Does eye colour affect vision in any meaningful way? Or is it mostly appearance with only minor practical consequences? That is where the story turns next, because once we have taken the personality myths away, what remains is a more useful and more grounded question about the relationship between colour, light, and the ordinary mechanics of seeing. Once we strip away the personality folklore and the internet quizzes that insist your eye colour reveals whether you're passionate, mysterious, reliable, or secretly difficult at brunch, what remains is a much more interesting question. Does eye colour actually affect the way the eye works? Not in some grand symbolic sense, but in the practical, ordinary biological sense. Does a dark iris do anything differently from a light one? Does blue versus brown change what a person can see, how they handle brightness, how light behaves inside the eye, or how comfortable vision feels under certain conditions? The answer, as with most things in biology, is both simpler and less dramatic than people hope, but still not trivial. Eye colour does have some relationship to light and vision, mostly because pigment in the iris affects how much stray light is absorbed rather than scattered. But this relationship should be understood in proportion. Eye colour can influence aspects of visual experience, especially sensitivity to bright light, yet it does not divide humanity into separate optical species. Brown-eyed people are not walking around with built-in tactical sunglasses, and blue-eyed people are not permanently doomed to squint toward the horizon like minor characters in a historical drama. The place to begin is with the job of the iris itself. We have already met it as the coloured ring around the pupil, but its main function is not decoration. The iris controls pupil size, and pupil size helps regulate how much light enters the eye. In bright conditions, the pupil constricts. In dim conditions, it widens. This is an automatic process, handled by muscles in the iris responding through the nervous system without requiring any conscious effort from you. The iris is, in that sense, one of the quiet workers of vision. It helps maintain a useful level of incoming light so the retina at the back of the eye can do its job properly. Because the iris is also pigmented, the amount of melanin it contains influences not just its appearance, but also how much light is absorbed within that tissue. More pigment usually means more absorption. Less pigment means less absorption, and potentially more stray light scattering within the eye. That last part matters most when we talk about lighter versus darker eyes. A heavily pigmented iris, such as one appearing dark brown, tends to absorb more light. A lightly pigmented iris, such as one appearing blue, grey, or some lighter green or hazel variation, allows more of the optical scattering effect that produced those colours in the first place. In practical terms, that can mean that people with lighter eyes may be somewhat more sensitive to bright light or glare under some conditions. The key word there is may. This is not a rule that defines every person perfectly. Plenty of dark-eyed people dislike bright sunlight, and plenty of light-eyed people go about their lives without dramatic visual discomfort. Still, the general principle is sound. Less pigment in the iris can mean less internal absorption of stray light, which can contribute to a greater sense of brightness or glare. This is one reason lighter-eyed people sometimes report being more bothered by intense sun, reflective surfaces, or sudden bright environments. It is not that the basic mechanics of their vision are broken or weaker. It is that the optical environment inside the eye can be slightly different when there is less pigment to absorb scattered light. If you have ever known someone who steps out into a bright day and immediately reaches for sunglasses with the urgency of a person confronting a personal insult, eye pigmentation may be part of that story. Not the whole story, because visual comfort depends on many things, but part of it. The same principle can also show up in settings like snow, water, bright pavement, or other reflective scenes where glare becomes especially intense. At the same time, it is important not to exaggerate this into a myth that light-eyed people are perpetually at a functional disadvantage, or that dark-eyed people are naturally superior in all bright conditions. Vision is shaped by many structures beyond the iris. The cornea, lens, retina, tear film, nervous system, and brain all matter. The iris is just one part of the system. Eye colour can influence the handling of light, yes, but within a broader visual apparatus that is remarkably adaptable. Sunglasses exist, hats exist, squinting, regrettably, exists. Human beings are very good at compensating for ordinary differences in light sensitivity. So while eye colour may help explain why one person loves bright beach light, and another behaves as though the sun has taken a personal dislike to them, it is not a complete map of visual life. There is also a tendency to assume that because lighter eyes may be more light sensitive, they must therefore see worse in bright conditions or perhaps better in low light, as though eye colour comes with a hidden set of trade-offs like optional equipment. The evidence for dramatic performance differences in everyday vision based purely on eye colour is much thinner than popular claims suggest. The iris influences incoming light, but it does not rewrite the entire visual system. A light-eyed person can have excellent vision. A dark-eyed person can have poor vision. One brown-eyed person may hate glare. One blue-eyed person may barely notice it. When eye colour does have functional implications, they are usually modest tendencies, not deterministic rules. That distinction matters because once a visible trait gets linked to function, people immediately start building hierarchies around it, and most of those hierarchies dissolve the moment actual individuals arrive. Still, the optical logic is worth understanding. Melanin in the iris absorbs light. That is part of why brown eyes look darker to begin with. More incoming light gets absorbed rather than scattered back outward, in a way we perceive as blue or grey. That same absorption can help reduce some internal light scatter. Less melanin means the iris appears lighter because more scattering effects are visible, and it also means there may be slightly less damping of stray light within the eye. This is not a dramatic difference like comparing a closed curtain to an open window. It is more subtle than that. But subtle does not mean meaningless. Much of human sensory life consists of subtle thresholds, small comforts, small irritations, slight differences in how intensely the world arrives. The pupil response is part of this story too. In bright conditions, everyone's pupils constrict, regardless of eye colour. That reduces the amount of light entering the eye and improves optical control. The iris, being muscular as well as pigmented, performs this task across all eye colours. So one should not imagine that lighter eyes simply sit there passively, letting in whatever chaos the sun provides. They are still functioning irises, still adjusting pupil size efficiently. The difference lies more in pigmentation than in the muscular mechanics. The same pupil response exists, but the surrounding tissue has different optical properties depending on melanin content. That is why the effect is real but limited. The iris has more than one way of managing light, and colour is only one part of that management. A related issue is glare, which is one of those common experiences that people struggle to define, but know immediately when they encounter it. Glare is not just brightness. It is brightness in a form that interferes with comfort or visual clarity. A bright white road at noon, sun flashing off water, snow under clear winter light, reflective glass, high-contrast artificial lighting in an over-enthusiastic office, these can all produce glare. Because iris pigmentation influences how light is handled, lighter-eyed individuals may sometimes experience these situations as harsher. Again, not always, not universally, and not to the extent that eye colour alone predicts daily suffering. But enough that the biology lines up with the reports many people make. It is one of the few everyday functional differences related to eye colour that has a plausible and grounded explanation. There's also the question of whether darker eyes are somehow better at tolerating sunlight. Better is a dangerous word in biology because it invites ranking where context is more useful. Darker irises, with more melanin, may absorb more light and reduce some stray scatter, which can be advantageous for comfort in bright conditions. But that does not make brown eyes a universally superior design. They are simply one outcome in a varied species. Eye colour evolved within broader human histories, and many traits that are advantageous in one setting are neutral or only slightly relevant in another. The body is not optimized for one ideal environment or one ideal visual style. It is workable across many. The fact that iris pigmentation has small optical consequences does not turn eye colour into a scorecard. The retina, meanwhile, is where the real work of seeing happens. Light enters through the cornea, passes through the pupil and lens, and is focused onto the retina, which contains photoreceptor cells that convert light into neural signals. Eye colour does not directly change the basic retinal machinery in a simple, one-to-one way. A blue-eyed retina is not fundamentally different in design from a brown-eyed retina because the iris in front happens to contain less pigment. This is another reason eye colour myths about special vision powers tend to be exaggerated. The iris can influence the optical conditions under which light enters, but the underlying sensory apparatus remains broadly the same human apparatus. Differences in vision quality, acuity, focusing, colour vision, and eye health depend on many factors, most of which have little to do with iris shade. That said, there are conditions in which pigmentation more broadly across the eye becomes important. In albinism, for example, Reduced melanin affects not only appearance but also visual development and function in more substantial ways, but that is a distinct medical context, not a simple extension of ordinary eye colour variation. It would be a mistake to drag every discussion of pigmentation into the territory of pathology. Normal differences in iris colour among healthy people are just that, normal differences. They may influence light sensitivity to some degree, but they do not in themselves indicate visual disorder. This distinction matters because people often hear that pigment affects light handling and then leap straight to fear or overinterpretation. Biology is quieter than that most of the time. Another practical area where eye colour and light meet is photography, and although this may sound superficial, it reveals something real about optics. Lighter eyes often appear more reflective or vivid in certain lighting because their lower pigmentation allows scattering effects to become visually prominent. Darker eyes may require stronger direct light or closer viewing for their internal patterns to show. This has nothing to do with their actual depth or expressiveness as human features, and everything to do with how light interacts with pigment. It is one reason people sometimes think light eyes shine more or look more dramatic in portraits. The camera is reacting to the optical behaviour of the iris, so is the observer. The dark eye may be no less detailed, but its higher pigmentation absorbs more and reveals less of its internal texture at a casual glance. This becomes especially clear when people with dark brown eyes step into bright natural light and suddenly reveal amber, copper, or honey tones that were invisible indoors. The eye did not become more beautiful in that moment. It simply became more legible to the observer because the lighting changed. Brown eyes often suffer from being underestimated in poor conditions. A camera or indoor lamp may flatten them into one dark note, while sunlight uncovers the subtle gradients and textures that lighter eyes display more readily. In this sense, eye colour affects not only light sensitivity, but the visibility of its own detail. Light eyes announce themselves more quickly because of contrast and scattering. Dark eyes often require better conditions to reveal what they have been doing quietly all along. There is also the matter of night vision, which people sometimes link to eye colour with great enthusiasm and very mixed reliability. Popular claims occasionally suggest that one eye colour sees better in the dark than another, but the evidence for any strong everyday advantage is not especially compelling. Low-light vision depends heavily on retinal rod cells, neural processing, adaptation, and overall eye health. Iris pigmentation may influence comfort in bright light more clearly than it influences true night vision performance. A person may feel that their light eyes help in low light simply because they have noticed strong daytime sensitivity, and assume the opposite must be true at night. But biology is not always so symmetrical. The mechanisms are different, and dramatic conclusions are usually premature. The same caution applies to claims about reaction times, sports performance, or learning styles linked to eye colour. These ideas appear from time to time, often carried by simplified interpretations of small studies or by the irresistible human desire to turn visible traits into predictions. But the closer one looks, the more these claims tend to soften into uncertainty. It is one thing to say, iris pigmentation can affect the handling of bright light. It is another to say brown-eyed people are naturally better at one activity, and blue-eyed people another. Those are the sorts of claims that travel far because they are memorable, not because they are robust. Eye colour can shape the optical entrance of light. From there to personality, talent, or destiny is a much longer journey than popular science usually admits. In practical life, the most honest statement is that eye colour may slightly influence how comfortable different lighting conditions feel. That is useful. It can explain why someone strongly prefers sunglasses, wide-brimmed hats, softer room lighting, or lower screen brightness. It can also explain why another person seems less bothered by harsh glare. These are not signs of fragility or toughness. They are just small individual differences in how the visual system experiences incoming light. Once you see it that way, eye colour becomes less of an identity badge and more of one modest variable in a larger sensory life. There is something else worth noticing here too. The same pigment that shapes the appearance of the iris participates in protecting and managing the eye's light environment. In other words, what we call beauty in the eye is tied directly to function. The brown eye that looks deep and soft is pigmented in a way that absorbs more light. The blue eye that catches light so strikingly does so because low pigment allows scattering to dominate. The green or hazel eye that seems to change with the room is displaying the complexity of intermediate pigment and structure. These are not decorative accidents sitting on top of a visual organ. They are the visible face of the organ's materials. That is one of the loveliest features of biology, I think. The body so often arranges for function and appearance to emerge from the same structure rather than from separate layers of design. And because eye colour is tied to light behaviour, it also becomes a reminder that seeing is never just about the eye alone. Vision is interaction. Light arrives from the world, passes through biological structures, is shaped by pigment and optics, hits the retina, travels through nerves, and is interpreted by the brain. Eye colour belongs at the entrance to that system. It helps shape the conditions under which light enters, but it is not the whole story of perception. This is why people with the same eye colour can experience the visual world very differently, and people with different eye colours can experience it quite similarly. The iris matters, yes, but only as part of a broader chain. Perhaps that is the most sensible way to answer the question. Eye colour affects light and vision a little, in ways that mostly come down to pigment and glare, rather than dramatic differences in what humans can fundamentally see. Lighter irises may be more prone to brightness sensitivity because they contain less melanin. Darker irises may absorb more stray light and sometimes feel more comfortable in harsh brightness. But these are tendencies, not destinies. They are modest effects within a remarkably adaptable sensory system. Useful to know, certainly. Good justification for a quality pair of sunglasses, perhaps. But not the sort of difference that should launch 1,000 theories about superiority, weakness, or secret talents. And once the practical side is in place, the broader story of eye colour begins to gather itself again. We have looked at pigment, optics, variation, inheritance, change over time, myth and visual function. The last piece waiting in the wings is the largest one of all. If eye colour is shaped by ancestry, genetics and population history, then what does the whole pattern reveal about human evolution? Why do these differences exist across our species in the first place? And what do they tell us about where we came from, how we moved, and how visible traits can carry long histories quietly in the face? That is where the eye stops being only a personal feature and starts becoming part of the much bigger human story. By the time we reach the question of what human eyes reveal about evolution, the subject has quietly grown far beyond the mirror. It is no longer only about whether your eyes are brown or blue or green or hazel, no longer only about pigment or light or genetics in the narrow sense. It becomes a question about time, population, survival, chance, and the long, uneven path by which human beings became visibly varied while remaining one species. Eye colour may seem like a small thing, just a ring of tissue around the pupil, a feature people mention in photographs or family stories, but it carries a deep history. Not because it contains hidden wisdom or ancient spiritual codes, but because it is one of those traits where ancestry, biology and human movement all leave traces that can still be seen in ordinary faces. The first thing human eyes reveal about evolution is that the original human story was almost certainly darker, not lighter. Brown eyes, with higher melanin in the iris, are widely understood to reflect the ancestral condition in our species. That matters because it places darker eye pigmentation not in the category of one option among many equally old alternatives, but as the starting point from which later visible variation emerged. Early humans did not begin as a neat mix of eye colours waiting to be sorted by fashion. The species appears to have begun with darker pigmentation patterns, linked to the same broad biological systems that shaped skin and hair pigmentation. In that sense, brown eyes are not simply common. They are ancient in the human line. They belong to the deep baseline from which much of our later variation unfolded. That alone tells us something important about evolution, which is that common traits are often the oldest ones, the longest carried ones, the ones that have been travelling with a species for so long that people stop noticing they have a history at all. We tend to become excited by what is rarer or more visually unusual. Blue eyes, green eyes, striking hazel, the unusual catches attention. Brown eyes, being globally widespread, are often treated as though they are just there, part of the scenery. But evolution is not impressed by what draws compliments in a bright room. Evolution leaves behind whatever has been inherited successfully across immense stretches of time. Brown eyes tell us about continuity. They tell us that for most of human history, darker iris pigmentation remained the usual outcome, passed on again and again across populations spreading through the world. And yet human eyes also reveal that evolution is never only about continuity, it is also about variation, and variation is where the story becomes more visibly complicated. At some point in human history, genetic variants affecting pigment production in the iris became more common in certain populations, especially in Europe, leading to lower melanin in the front layers of the iris and the possibility of blue and other lighter eye colours. That shift matters not because it created a better kind of eye, which it did not, but because it shows how visible human traits can change in frequency when populations move, separate, mix, shrink, grow, and carry different genetic combinations through time. Evolution does not work by issuing a single human template and then making one tiny decorative exception. It works by preserving a great deal of shared biology while allowing certain traits to vary as lineages branch and histories accumulate. This is where human eyes begin to tell a story, not only of adaptation, but of population history. Some traits become common because they are strongly selected for. Others become common in certain places because of genetic drift, founder effects, or repeated inheritance within populations that remained relatively small or somewhat isolated for long enough. Eye colour appears to reflect a mixture of these possibilities. Darker pigmentation clearly belongs to the ancestral human framework. Lighter eyes, by contrast, seem to have become concentrated in particular populations later. Scientists have debated exactly why that happened. Some possibilities include random drift in smaller populations, some form of sexual selection, or the simple fact that once a visible variant exists, it can spread under certain social and demographic conditions without needing to provide some enormous survival advantage. That uncertainty is actually one of the most honest things evolution can reveal. Human beings often want a dramatic answer for every trait. If blue eyes exist, surely they must have been selected for because they made people especially good at something, or gave them some impressive hidden edge over their brown-eyed neighbours. But evolution is not always so tidy or purposeful. Sometimes a trait becomes more frequent because populations are small, because people mate within certain groups, because a variant happens to spread, because chance and history are doing more work than heroically clear adaptation. Not every visible human trait needs to come with a triumphant survival story attached to it. Some come with quieter stories, stories of migration, isolation, ancestry, and probability. That may sound less glamorous than the popular imagination prefers, but it is far more revealing. Human eyes show us that evolution is not an engineer building one optimal face. It is a historical process working through inherited variation. It keeps what functions, modifies what can change, and allows many traits to persist or spread without turning them into symbols of perfection. Eye colour is useful here because the function of the iris remains the same across the spectrum. Brown, blue, green, grey, hazel, they all belong to working human eyes. The iris still regulates pupil size. The visual system still operates. Differences in pigmentation can have small optical consequences, yes, but they do not divide human beings into fundamentally separate biological types. Evolution has produced variation without producing separate designs of humanity. That, in itself, is a powerful lesson. Another thing human eyes reveal about evolution is how deeply shared our biology still is beneath visible difference. It is easy to look at eye colour categories and imagine sharp divisions: brown versus blue, light versus dark, common versus rare. But once you know how the trait works, those divisions soften. There is one main pigment system. There are related genes influencing melanin production and distribution. There is one iris structure doing the same basic job in every person. There is light scattering, absorption, and perception. The differences that appear so striking in daily life are produced by shifts in amount, distribution, and development within a shared system. Evolution, in other words, has not written entirely separate scripts for different eye colours. It has played variations on one theme. That is true of a great many human traits, and the eyes make it especially easy to see. This is one reason visible differences can be so misleading when people use them as proof of deep human separation. Eye colour feels immediate because the face is immediate, but the trait itself is a reminder of how small many visible differences really are in biological terms. A blue iris and a brown iris are not evidence of separate human categories in any grand sense. They are evidence that one species can vary visibly while remaining profoundly shared underneath. The same body plan, the same tissues, the same organ systems, the same developmental logic, with some genes nudging pigment higher here and lower there. Evolution in humans is variation layered onto commonality, not difference replacing sameness. Eyes make that easy to forget socially, because they are so expressive and so central to the face, but biologically they make it easy to remember once you look closely. There is also the remarkable fact that human eyes are not only varied in iris colour, but unusual in another visual way. The white of the eye, the sclera, is highly visible in humans compared with many other animals. This matters because it makes gaze direction easy to read. You can often tell very quickly where another person is looking, whether their attention has shifted, whether they have noticed something, whether they are meeting your eyes or avoiding them. Many researchers have argued that this visible contrast in the human eye is tied to our social evolution, our reliance on cooperation, shared attention, communication, and reading intention from the face. In that sense, the human eye reveals not just pigmentation history but social history. It is part of a face built for being read by others. That feature becomes even more interesting when placed beside iris colour. Human beings evolved eyes that are socially legible, eyes whose direction can be followed, eyes that help coordinate group attention, and within that socially visible system, iris colour diversified in some populations while remaining dark in others. So the human eye is both shared and varied in a very particular way. It is a communicative organ as well as a visual one. We use it to see and to be seen. We read emotion from it, though often imperfectly. We form impressions from it, often too quickly. Evolution did not make the human eye colourful in the flamboyant sense seen in birds or insects, but it did leave room for subtle variation inside an unusually readable facial structure. That combination may help explain why eye colour attracts so much attention. It sits inside one of the most socially important parts of the body. Human eyes also reveal that evolution does not erase older traits when newer variations arise. Brown eyes did not disappear when lighter eyes emerged in some populations. Blue eyes did not spread everywhere simply because they became possible. Green and hazel did not replace either extreme. Instead, the older trait remained globally dominant while newer variants became common only in certain places and lineages. This is a good reminder that evolution is not a queue in which every new trait patiently waits to replace the previous model. It is more like a branching record of what can coexist. If a trait works, it may persist. If a variation also works, it may persist too. The result is not a march toward one final answer, but a patterned diversity shaped by time and inheritance. That patterned diversity becomes especially visible when families are considered. One family may carry mostly dark eyes for generations, then suddenly a lighter-eyed child appears because of combinations that were hidden in the background all along. Another family may contain several shades at once. siblings differing in ways that make perfect sense genetically even if they surprise their parents. Evolution works through populations, but it leaves its marks in households. You can see ancient migration, mixed ancestry, retained variants, and long genetic histories playing out quietly in living rooms and school portraits. That is one of the loveliest things about human evolution, really. It is not only buried in fossils or genome databases, it also appears in cousins standing next to one another in ordinary light. Of course, once visible variation exists, human culture gets hold of it. That too becomes part of the evolutionary story, though more indirectly. Preferences, symbolism, local ideas of beauty, familiarity and strangeness can all shape how traits are perceived, and perhaps in some cases how often they are passed on if mate choice plays a role. This is where sexual selection enters the conversation, always in a slightly speculative but interesting way. It is possible that visible traits like eye colour could have been influenced not only by random population history, but also by what people found noticeable or attractive in particular settings. One has to be careful here, because it is very easy to invent prehistoric romance plots and then mistake them for science. But the broader point holds. Human evolution is not only about surviving climate and disease, it is also about choosing one another, living in groups, responding to appearance, and carrying those choices into future generations. Even if sexual selection played some role, though, it would still be working on variation within a shared human framework. Eye colour does not tell a story of different species competing. It tells a story of one species diversifying in visible ways while remaining interwoven. That is why it can be dangerous when people treat visible traits as though they justify hierarchy. Evolution does not support that reading. It supports history. Brown eyes are ancient and widespread. Blue and green and other lighter eyes are later variations concentrated in particular population histories. None of that establishes superiority. It only establishes that human beings moved, changed, inherited, mixed, and remained human throughout. And perhaps that is the deepest thing human eyes reveal about evolution. They reveal that the body keeps records, but not in the way myths imagine. The eye does not reveal character or worth or destiny. It reveals ancestry in broad traces. It reveals pigment pathways. It reveals how one species can contain both continuity and variation. It reveals that small differences in genes and development can create noticeable visible outcomes without altering the fundamental architecture underneath. It reveals that what we experience as beauty or rarity is often the surface expression of long, patient history. It reveals that the ordinary face is full of ancient information, even if that information is not the sort people expect. There is something very grounding about that. We spend so much time looking at faces socially that we forget they are evolutionary documents as well. Not documents in the cold bureaucratic sense, of course. More like living records, written in tissue and carried forward generation by generation. An iris is not just an attractive detail. It is the result of melanocytes doing what they have done for thousands of years, genes being passed on and reshuffled, populations moving and mingling, developmental processes repeating with slight differences, and light revealing the outcome each time someone looks up. That is an extraordinary amount of history for something most of us reduce to a single word on a form. And still the eye remains modest. It does not announce any of this loudly. It simply sits there in the centre of the face, doing its work, taking in light, signalling attention, carrying pigment in one arrangement or another. We are the ones who load it with poetry, suspicion, attraction, symbolism, and half-finished theories about what it says. Evolution says something quieter. It says this is what a shared species looks like when it has travelled, varied, and endured. It says this is what continuity looks like with room for local difference. It says that common traits can be ancient, rare traits can be recent, and neither one needs to become a moral category. It says that the face is full of history, but history is not hierarchy. So when you think about what your eye colour actually means, after all of this, the answer is both smaller and larger than most people expect. Smaller because it does not reveal your soul, your fate, your private powers, or your secret temperament. Larger because it links you to the biology of pigment, the optics of light, the inheritance of genes, the development of tissue, the movement of populations, and the long human story that made visible variation possible in the first place. Your eyes are personal, certainly. They are also historical. They belong to you, and they belong to evolution's record of how one species can look so many slightly different ways while remaining recognizably, unmistakably human. And perhaps that is the nicest place to leave it. Not with a slogan about one eye colour being rarer or stronger or more meaningful than another, but with the quieter recognition that every iris is doing the same essential job through slightly different materials — brown, blue, green, hazel, grey. All of them are variations on one living design. All of them are shaped by melanin, structure, light, and inheritance. All of them have passed through the same basic evolutionary history, even when that history branched in visible ways. And all of them sit in faces that are older, stranger, and more connected than they first appear. So the next time you catch your own eyes in the mirror, or notice someone else's across a room, it may be worth remembering that you're not just looking at colour. You're looking at biology made visible, history made ordinary, and evolution resting very quietly in the middle of the face.